Eleanor Whitmore pressed her son against her chest and did not look back. Not once. The gates of Ashford Estate closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid, final, hollow, cruel. She had loved that man for 6 years. She had buried his father beside him, survived drought beside him, kept his home alive when everything crumbled. And in return, he had handed her a letter of dismissal like she was a servant who had failed to perform her duties. She was 26 years old, and her husband had thrown her away. Before we go any further, if this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The summer of 1817 came to Virginia like a punishment. The heat pressed down on the hills around Ashford Estate from the first week of June, scorching the tobacco fields, drying the creek beds, and turning the red clay roads into something that cracked under wagon wheels like old bones. Even the horses moved slow. Even the birds stayed quiet until evening. But inside the main house, the temperature was of a different kind. Eleanor Whitmore sat at the edge of the bed she had shared with Nathaniel Ashford for 6 years, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight as a church pew. She was not crying. She had spent all her tears the night before alone in the washroom with the door bolted and a cloth pressed to her mouth so no one could hear her. Now she was simply waiting. The letter sat on the vanity across the room. She had not touched it since Nathaniel placed it there 3 hours ago. She did not need to touch it. She had read it 4 times already, and every word was burned into her. It is with great sorrow and reluctant necessity that I, Nathaniel Charles Ashford, do formally relieve my wife, Eleanor Grace Whitmore Ashford, of her duties and obligations to this household. Duties. Obligations. 6 years of marriage reduced to a legal document that sounded like the dismissal of a housekeeper. She heard his footsteps in the hallway. She recognized them the way you recognize a voice, the particular weight of them, the slight pause before the door, the way his right boot always landed a half-second heavier than his left. She had memorized those sounds in their first year together when she used to feel warmth rise in her chest at the sound of him coming home. Now her chest felt like an empty well. The door opened. Nathaniel Ashford was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once seemed to Eleanor like an anchor, steady and strong and permanent. He was 34 years old and looked every year of it today. There were shadows under his eyes she had not seen before. His jaw was set in that particular way it got when he had already made a decision and had come not to discuss it, but to execute it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "The carriage will be ready at dawn," he said finally. His voice was quiet. That almost made it worse. "I know," Eleanor said. "I read the letter." Eleanor. "Don't." She said it without raising her voice. Just one word, flat and final. "Don't tell me this is for my sake. Don't tell me you are protecting me. I am asking you not to say those things." He stopped. He looked at the window instead of at her. "Dr. Beaumont was very clear," he said. "Dr. Beaumont," she repeated, and something in her voice sharpened just slightly. Not anger exactly, but something colder than anger. "A man your uncle hired. A man I have never trusted. He examined you twice. He told you what Charles wanted him to tell you." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "That is not a fair accusation. Is it not?" She stood up then. Not dramatically, just stood the way a woman stands when she has decided she will not remain sitting while someone dismantles her life. "Charles has wanted you to remarry since before your father was cold in the ground. He has made no secret of it. He wants a son from you, a son he can shape and influence and eventually use to take control of your land. And I stand in the way of that. Eleanor, you are not well. I am not well because I have been told for 2 years that my body is broken," she said. "I am not well because I have listened to doctors who looked at me like I was a faulty piece of machinery. I am not well because my husband has decided that a man he barely trusts is more reliable than the woman who has been beside him for 6 years. She paused. "That is why I am not well, Nathaniel." He turned from the window then, and she could see the conflict in his face, the guilt and the grief, and something else beneath both of those, something stubborn and defended that told her the decision was already sealed. "I cannot keep you here," he said. "I cannot watch you suffer through another year of hope and disappointment. The estate needs an heir," she finished for him. "I know, I have heard it more times than I can count." "That is not the only thing. It is the only thing, Nathaniel." Her voice cracked slightly on his name, and she hated that. She pressed her lips together. "Everything else, the love, the years, the life we built, all of it becomes secondary to the one thing I apparently cannot provide. That is what I am hearing. That is what this letter says, even if your words are too kind to admit it." He did not contradict her. That silence was the answer. "I will be ready at dawn," she said. The house felt different that night. Eleanor moved through it slowly, after Nathaniel retired, or pretended to retire, because she could see the light still burning under his study door at midnight. She walked through the parlor where they had sat together reading on winter evenings. She walked through the dining room where they had hosted the Harmon family for Christmas 2 years ago, and laughed until her sides hurt over something she could no longer remember. She walked through the kitchen, where old Ruth the cook had taught her to make the spiced apple preserves that Nathaniel liked in October. She touched things as she passed them. Not packing them, not gathering them, just touching them. Saying goodbye to them the way you say goodbye to a life. She stopped in the library. This had been her favorite room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old paper and leather. 2 armchairs, angled toward the fireplace. Nathaniel had given her the key to this room on their wedding night and told her it was hers to use whenever she wanted. She had spent more hours in this room than anywhere else in the house. On the shelf near the window, still in the same place she had put it 3 years ago, was the small carved wooden bird Nathaniel had made for her during their first winter together. He was not a skilled carver. The bird was lopsided, and the wings were uneven, but he had worked on it every evening for 2 weeks and presented it to her like it was the finest gift in Virginia. She picked it up. She stood there with it in her hand for a long time. Then she put it in her pocket and walked upstairs to finish packing. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the summer night outside, the cicadas, the distant sound of the creek, the occasional call of something in the woods. And she thought about what she had not said to Nathaniel, because there were things she had not said. She had not told him about the morning 3 weeks ago, when she had woken with a feeling so strange and so unfamiliar that she had sat on the edge of the bed for an hour trying to name it. She had not told him because she had told herself it was nothing that she had been told too many times to hope that her body had deceived her before, that she would not allow herself to feel that particular hope again until she was certain. She had not told him because she was afraid, now lying in the dark. On the last night she would spend in this house, she pressed her hand flat against her stomach. The feeling was still there, quiet, hidden, stubborn as a spring bulb pushing up through frozen ground. It is probably nothing, she told herself. But her hand stayed where it was. Dawn came orange and brutal. The carriage was waiting when Eleanor descended the front steps with her 2 bags. She had not been given permission to take more than that, and she had not asked for more. Hector, the young stable hand who had worked at Ashford Estate since he was 12 years old, stood at the horses' heads with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground. He could not look at her. "Morning, Miss Eleanor," he said quietly. "Morning, Hector." She touched his shoulder briefly as she passed. "Take good care of Biscuit for me." Biscuit was the old bay mare Eleanor had been given when she first came to the estate. She could not take her. She had tried not to think about that. Hector made a sound that was not quite words. The housekeeper. Mrs. Graves stood at the top of the steps. She was 60 years old and had worked for the Ashford family for 30 of those years, and her face was the most carefully neutral thing Eleanor had ever seen. But her eyes were red and her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were pale. "The master will see you before you go," Mrs. Graves said. "He doesn't need to." He asked. Eleanor considered this. Then she nodded once and went back inside. Check time. Nathaniel was in the front parlor. He was standing, which told her something a man who sits in a chair when he's making a goodbye feels more permanent about it. A man who stands is still in conflict with himself. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I had Mr. Caldwell draw up an arrangement. You will receive an allowance." "I don't want an allowance." "Eleanor, I want my husband," she said plainly. "But since that is no longer a possibility, I will manage without charity." His face did something complicated. "It is not charity. It is—" "What is it, Nathaniel? Tell me plainly what it is." He stopped. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I am sorry," he said. "I am genuinely sorry." "I know you are," she said. And she did. She could see it in every line of his face, the real grief of a man who believed he was doing the merciful thing and hated himself for the necessity of it. "But sorry does not change what you have chosen to believe over me." She picked up her bags. "Goodbye, Nathaniel." She walked out of the parlor, down the hall, out the front door, down the steps, into the carriage. She did not look back, not once. They had been on the road for 2 hours when Eleanor felt the first cramp. It was not severe, not at first. A tightening low and unfamiliar that she tried to attribute to the jolting of the carriage over the summer-hardened road. She shifted position. She pressed her hand to her side. She looked out the window at the passing farmland and told herself it was nothing. The second cramp was harder. Ma'am, the driver, a man named Tobias, who had worked for the Ashfords for 20 years, called down through the small hatch above her head. "You all right? You gone awful quiet." "I'm fine," she said automatically. The third cramp made her gasp. "Ma'am, Tobias." She pressed her palm flat against the seat to steady herself. "There is a farmhouse. About half a mile back. I saw it as we passed. White fence. Pull over and ask if there is a midwife nearby. Please." A pause. "Ma'am, Mr. Ashford said I was to take you straight to Tobias." Her voice was very quiet and very controlled. "Pull over." He pulled over. The farmhouse belonged to a family named Colton, a husband and wife, both of them in their 50s. Both of them the kind of people who opened their door without asking questions when they saw a pale young woman being helped up their porch steps by a frightened-looking driver. "Lord have mercy," said the woman whose name was Annie Colton, and she immediately took Eleanor's arm and guided her inside. "When did the pain start?" "About an hour ago, maybe less." "How far along are you?" Eleanor stopped. She met Annie Colton's eyes. "I was told I could not, that I was unable." She stopped again. Annie Colton looked at her for one long assessing moment. Then she turned to her husband and said, "Go fetch Margaret Hale. Right now. Run Joseph." He ran. Margaret Hale had been the midwife in that county for 37 years. She had delivered over 200 babies. She had seen things that would make most doctors weep with ignorance. She had delivered twins in a barn during a lightning storm and a breech birth in the back of a moving wagon. And once she had caught a baby that came so fast, the mother had no warning at all. She was 61 years old and walked with a slight limp from an old injury, but she arrived at the Colton farmhouse in under 20 minutes with her bag over her shoulder and the particular calm expression of a woman who has never once panicked in a crisis. She came into the room where Eleanor had been laid out on the spare bed, took one look and said, "Send the driver to wait outside. Give me water and clean cloth, and then all of you out." They obeyed. The door closed. Margaret set down her bag, pulled up a chair, and looked at Eleanor directly. "How far along do you think you are?" she asked. "I don't know," Eleanor said. "I didn't know. I was told I could not conceive. I was told—" "Who told you that?" "Dr. Beaumont, from Richmond." Something shifted in Margaret Hale's expression. Not quite alarm, something more like recognition. "James Beaumont," she said. "You know him." "I know of him." The old woman's voice was carefully neutral. "What else did Dr. Beaumont tell you?" Eleanor watched her. "He told my husband that I was barren, that no treatment would change it, that the marriage could not produce an heir." Margaret said nothing for a moment. She set her bag on the table beside the bed and opened it with hands that were extremely deliberate. "Mrs. Ashford," she said quietly, "I am going to examine you now, and I need you to be completely honest with me about everything you have been feeling. Every change, every symptom. no matter how small or how long ago. She looked up. Can you do that? Yes, Eleanor said. Good. She paused. And I need you not to be afraid of what I might find. Eleanor looked at her. Her heart was doing something unsteady in her chest. What do you think you might find? She asked. Margaret Hale did not answer immediately. She pulled back the blanket and began her examination with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this more times than she could count. And then, after a few minutes, she went very still. She lifted her head. She looked at Eleanor's face. Mrs. Ashford, she said, and her voice was so gentle it was almost a blow in itself. You are not dying. Eleanor stared at her. You are not sick, Margaret continued. You are not broken. You are not any of the things that man told your husband you were. The room was perfectly silent, except for the sound of summer birds outside, and the distant noise of Joseph Colton's horses in their pasture. Eleanor's lips moved, but no sound came out. You are in labor, Margaret Hale said plainly. And from what I can tell you are further along than either of us might have guessed, which means Mrs. Ashford. She paused. That somewhere in the last few months when you were being told that your body was incapable of life, it was quietly doing the most extraordinary thing it has ever done. Eleanor felt something go through her that she could not name. Not happiness exactly, not yet. Something more foundational than happiness. Something that felt like the world rearranging itself into a shape she had forgotten was possible. I'm going to have a baby, she said. It was not a question. You are, Margaret said. And from what I can see soon. 6 hours later, as the summer sun dropped toward the tree line and painted the Virginia hills in shades of bronze and amber, Eleanor Grace Whitmore Ashford brought a son into the world. He came into it fighting, which Margaret Hale said was a very good sign. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn mouth, and he cried with a fury that filled the small bedroom of the Colton farmhouse, and made Annie Colton, standing in the hallway with her hands over her heart, begin to weep quietly. Eleanor lay back against the pillow, with her son on her chest, and looked at him. Just looked at him. For a long, long moment, she did not speak. She did not think about Nathaniel. She did not think about the letter on the vanity, or the carriage, or the road she had traveled that morning, or the life she had been handed back like something returned from a shop. She just looked at her son. His eyes were closed. His hands were curled into tiny fists. He was breathing in that rapid, shallow way of very new things, and Eleanor could feel each breath against her collarbone, like a small and perfect heartbeat. Hello, she said softly. I've been waiting for you. He made a sound. Margaret, cleaning up at the table nearby, smiled without looking up. He's got strong lungs, she said. That's a good sign. He's perfect, Eleanor said. There was no other word for it. Hi is? Margaret set down her cloth and turned. She looked at Eleanor for a moment at the exhaustion and the wonder and the particular expression of a woman who has just been handed back everything that was taken from her, and her voice was quiet when she spoke again. Mrs. Ashford, I need to speak with you about something. Eleanor looked up. Not tonight, Margaret continued quickly. Tonight is for him and for you. But tomorrow there are things you should know. About Dr. Beaumont. About who sent him and what he was paid to say. She paused. There are things your husband deserves to know as well. Eleanor looked down at her son again. My husband, she said slowly, sent me away this morning in a carriage with 2 bags and an allowance he knew I would refuse. Yes, he believed a man his uncle hired over 6 years of marriage. Yes. He chose. She stopped. She pressed her lips to the top of her son's head. When she looked back up, her expression was not angry. It was something more controlled than anger and more dangerous. Tell me what you know, Margaret. Tell me all of it. The old woman pulled up a chair, and she began to talk. James Beaumont had not always been corrupt, or at least that was what Margaret Hale believed from what she knew of him. He had been a competent physician in his younger years, practicing out of Richmond with a decent enough reputation. But by 1815, his practice was failing. He had debts. He had made poor decisions and worse investments. And when a man named Charles Whitmore Ashford arrived at his office with an offer that would clear those debts entirely, James Beaumont made one more bad decision. "I was paid," Margaret said plainly. "Paid to examine you and return a specific verdict. Not the verdict your health required. The verdict Charles Ashford required." Eleanor listened without speaking. "I know this because Beaumont examined my niece 2 years ago, a perfectly healthy young woman who was told she had a condition of the lungs that would likely kill her within the year. She came to me in a panic. I examined her myself. There was nothing wrong with her." Margaret's voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "When I confronted Beaumont, he dismissed me. He said I was an old woman with outdated methods, but I knew. And when I heard he had been brought in to examine the wife of Nathaniel Ashford..." She shook her head. "I worried." "Why did you not?" Eleanor began. "I did not know you," Margaret said simply. "I knew of you. Everyone in the county knows of the Ashford family. But I did not know you, and I had no proof, and the word of an old midwife against the word of a Richmond physician is not a word that carries much weight in this part of Virginia." She paused. "I am sorry for that. Truly." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. "Charles," she said quietly. "Why, he is Nathaniel's uncle. His own blood." "His own blood," Margaret agreed. "Who stands to inherit everything if Nathaniel dies without an heir? The Ashford estate, the land, the warehouses, the crops, the contracts, all of it would pass to Charles in the absence of a direct male heir. Nathaniel has no brothers. His father's will was very specific." She met Eleanor's eyes. "A childless Nathaniel is a very useful Nathaniel to a man like Charles." The pieces arranged themselves in Eleanor's mind with cold, terrible clarity. The years of doctors. The steady drip of disappointment, not just from the examinations, but from Charles, who always seemed to be nearby when Nathaniel received the results. Always offering his quiet, sorrowful sympathy. Always saying the right thing in the wrong way. Such a pity. Such a shame. Perhaps it is God's will that the Ashford name ends here. The way he had inserted himself more and more into the management of the estate over the past 2 years. The business meetings Eleanor had not been invited to attend. The contracts she had not been shown. "He has been preparing," she said. "For some time, I think." Eleanor looked down at her son. He was sleeping now, his mouth making small movements as if dreaming of something. His fists were uncurled, his fingers fanned open against her chest. She thought about Nathaniel standing at the window that morning, not looking at her. She thought about the letter on the vanity. She thought about 6 years of a man who had, underneath all of this, underneath the terrible decision he had made this morning, been a good man. A man who had loved her. A man who had been systematically, carefully, deliberately deceived. And she felt 2 things at once, which was not comfortable. She felt fury. And she felt something else. Something she was not ready to name yet, because it was too complicated, and the night was too young, and she had a newborn son on her chest, who needed her complete attention. "What do I do?" she asked. It was not a question she asked often. Eleanor was not a woman who asked others for direction. But she was exhausted, and she was alone, and she was in a farmhouse she had never seen before this morning, and the man who should have been beside her was 50 miles away, in a house that no longer bore her name. Margaret Hale looked at her with the calm, clear eyes of a woman who had watched 60 years of the world, and was not easily surprised by any of it. "Tonight," she said, "you do nothing except rest and feed that boy. Tonight is his." Eleanor nodded. "Tomorrow," Margaret continued, "we talk about what kind of woman you are going to be. Because you have a choice to make, Mrs. Ashford. You can be the woman who was wronged and abandoned and let that define you. Or you can be the woman who survived and let that define you." She paused. "From what I have seen of you today, I suspect you already know which one you are." Eleanor looked at her son. Then she looked back at Margaret. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Is there proof of what Beaumont was paid to do?" Something moved through Margaret's expression. "There might be," she said carefully. "Beaumont is a careless man in some respects, and there are people in Richmond who would talk if asked the right way." She held Eleanor's gaze. "I have been asking the right way for 2 years, Mrs. Ashford. I have been waiting for someone with standing to do something with what I find." The room was quiet. "My name," Eleanor said slowly, "is still Ashford. That letter is not a legal dissolution. It is a formal request that has not been answered yet." She lifted her chin slightly, a small motion, but one that meant something. "I have standing." Margaret Hale smiled. It was not a small smile. "I thought you might," she said. Outside, the Virginia summer night hummed and breathed and continued its indifferent business. Inside the Colton farmhouse, a woman who had been sent away to disappear lay in a borrowed bed with her son on her chest and began in the quiet and the dark to make plans. Her husband did not yet know he had a son. His uncle did not yet know the plan had failed. And somewhere in Richmond, a physician named James Beaumont was sleeping soundly, entirely unaware that an old midwife with 37 years of knowledge and a woman with nothing left to lose had just joined forces in a spare bedroom off the Charlottesville Road. The summer of 1817 was not finished yet, not even close. Margaret Hale left before sunrise. She pressed Eleanor's hand once at the door firm and briefed the way a woman presses another woman's hand when words are not sufficient and time is short. She said she would return in 2 days. She said she had letters to write and a man in Richmond she needed to speak with before the week was out. She said, and this she said quietly with her back to Annie Colton, who was bustling in the kitchen, that Eleanor should tell no one where she was staying. Not yet. Not even Tobias, Eleanor asked. Tobias the driver was still waiting somewhere outside, sleeping in his carriage or at the Coltons' barn. She had nearly forgotten about him entirely. "Especially not Tobias," Margaret said. "He works for the Ashford estate. That means he works for Charles Ashford as much as for your husband, whether he knows it or not." Eleanor looked at her. "You think Charles would—" "I think a man who paid a physician to declare his nephew's wife barren is not a man who will take the news of a healthy baby boy with any kind of grace," Margaret said flatly. "I think you and that child are in a more delicate position than you realize, Mrs. Ashford. And I think you need to stay exactly where you are until I know more." She left. Eleanor stood at the door for a moment after it closed, her son asleep in the crook of her left arm. The summer morning was just beginning to gray at the edges. She could hear roosters somewhere. She could hear her own heartbeat. Then she turned around and went back inside, because she had a child to feed and plans to make, and falling apart in doorways was a luxury she could not afford. Annie Colton did not ask questions. This was perhaps the greatest kindness anyone showed Eleanor in those first few days, the simple, generous silence of a woman who understood that some situations do not require explanation, only presence. She fed Eleanor. She brought water. She held the baby when Eleanor needed to sleep, sitting in the rocking chair by the window, with the infant against her chest, humming something low and tuneless that Eleanor could hear from the other room and found inexplicably comforting. Joseph Colton dismissed Tobias on the second morning. He did it simply and without cruelty, going out to the barn where the driver had been sleeping and telling him that the lady was unwell and being cared for, and that he could return to Ashford Estate and report that much, and that further information would follow in due course. Tobias looked uncomfortable. He looked at Joseph, and then at the house, and then back at Joseph. "Mr. Ashford will want to know more than that," Tobias said. "Then Mr. Ashford can come himself," Joseph replied, and went back inside. Tobias left. Eleanor, standing just inside the front window, where she could hear but not be seen, watched the carriage roll away down the summer road. She thought about what message it would carry back to Ashford Estate. She thought about Nathaniel receiving that message standing in his study or his parlor reading that his dismissed wife had fallen ill on the road and was being cared for at a farmhouse, and wondering perhaps if he had made a mistake. She hoped he was wondering. She was not yet sure what she wanted him to do with that wondering. She was not yet sure what she wanted at all. That was the most unsettling part in those early days. Eleanor had always been a woman who knew her own mind. It was one of the things Nathaniel had loved about her early on, or claimed to love, that quality of certainty she carried, the way she could walk into a room and understand within minutes what needed doing and who needed to do it. She had run his household for 6 years with that quality. She had managed his staff and his social obligations and the thousand small emergencies of a large estate with the calm efficiency of a woman who did not waste time on confusion. Now she felt confused. She sat with her son in the quiet of the Colton farmhouse, and she turned the last 6 years over in her mind. Like stones, she was examining for cracks, and she found cracks everywhere she looked, and she could not tell anymore which of those cracks had always been there, and which of them had been carved deliberately by a man with a plan. This was perhaps the worst of it. Not the loss of the house or the letter or even Nathaniel's face that last morning, the way he had looked at her with grief and resolution, and something that she now understood had been guilt, though she had not named it then. The worst of it was the retroactive unraveling, the looking back and not knowing what had been real. Had Nathaniel loved her? She believed he had. She believed it with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has spent 6 years sleeping beside someone and learned their breathing and their silences, and the small sounds they make when they are worried, and the specific way they reach for your hand in the dark when they think you are asleep. You cannot fake those things. You cannot manufacture 6 years of small, unconscious tenderness. But love had not been enough to make him trust her over a hired doctor. Love had not been enough to make him question the steady, careful pressure of his uncle's doubt. Love had not been enough, and that was the part she could not settle. She was still thinking about this on the third day when Margaret Hale came back. She came in the late afternoon, and she did not come alone. The woman with her was younger, perhaps 40, with a sharp face and quick eyes, and the particular bearing of someone who has spent a great deal of time in courtrooms or offices where important documents are handled. Her name was Mrs. Judith Crane, and she had traveled from Richmond, and she set her bag on the Colton's kitchen table with the brisk authority of a woman on a mission. "You are Mrs. Eleanor Ashford," she said to Eleanor. "I am," Eleanor said. Judith Crane looked at the baby in Eleanor's arms. Something moved through her expression, not sentimentality, but something adjacent to it, something controlled. "Margaret tells me you are aware of James Beaumont's arrangement with Charles Ashford," Judith said. "I am aware of what Margaret told me, which is what she knows. I would like to know more. That is why I am here." Judith opened her bag and produced a folder of papers. She spread them on the table with the economical precision of someone who has done this before. "My husband was a solicitor in Richmond for 20 years before he died. I have maintained certain connections in that capacity. One of those connections works in the counting house where Charles Ashford banks." She looked up. "Are you familiar with the name Weston and Carr?" Eleanor shook her head. "They are a private banking firm. Discreet, which is why Charles chose them. But discreet does not mean clean, and clean does not mean loyal. And one of the men at Weston and Carr has been unhappy with Charles Ashford for reasons of his own for some time." She tapped one of the papers on the table. "In October of 1815, a sum of $300 was transferred from Charles Ashford's personal account to an account held in the name of a James B. Beaumont physician." She paused to let that land. $300, Mrs. Ashford, at a time when Beaumont's practice was nearly insolvent. The room was quiet. Eleanor looked at the paper. She did not pick it up. She looked at the numbers on it, the dates, the names written in the careful hand of a bank clerk who had no idea what those numbers meant and had simply recorded them the way he recorded everything without judgment. $300, she said, to be followed by a further 200 upon satisfactory completion of the examination, Judith said, which by the bank records was paid in December of 1815, 2 weeks after Beaumont's report was delivered to your husband. Eleanor thought about December of 1815. She had been 24 years old. Nathaniel had told her the results in the library, the room she loved, sitting across from her in one of the armchairs holding her hands. His face doing that complicated thing she had not been able to read. She had asked him what it meant. He had said it meant they would need to think about the future. She had cried. He had held her. She had thought at the time that his grief was genuine. She still believed his grief was genuine. That was the terrible part. He had been lied to, and he had believed the lie, and his grief about the lie had been entirely real. That did not make him innocent. But it complicated the picture of him that she was trying to draw. "Is this enough?" she asked Judith. "Is this enough to do something with?" Judith considered this with the practical thoughtfulness of a woman who deals in facts and not in feelings. "It is enough to raise serious questions," she said. "It is enough to initiate a legal inquiry into the conduct of Dr. Beaumont and potentially into the conduct of Charles Ashford. It is not yet enough to compel a court to act quickly." She paused. However, Eleanor repeated, "there is a second matter." Judith sorted through her papers and produced another document. One, handwritten and clearly a letter. Beaumont was not careful enough. He kept a journal. A personal journal, which is a habit of vanity that has undone better men than him. My contact in Richmond managed to borrow certain pages. She slid the letter across the table to Eleanor. "You will want to read this." Eleanor shifted her son to her other arm and picked up the letter. The handwriting was cramped and slightly hurried, as if written quickly or in some emotional state. She read it once, then she read it again. It was a journal entry dated November 1815, and it was in the plain and unambiguous language of a man writing to himself, and therefore not bothering with pretense an account of what Charles Ashford had asked him to do, what he had agreed to do, and why. The Ashford woman is not barren. Any competent physician would recognize the signs of a recently corrected nutritional deficiency that has temporarily suppressed certain natural functions, a condition that is entirely reversible and in many cases self-correcting within 18 months. I have told Mr. Nathaniel Ashford none of this. I have delivered the verdict agreed upon with his uncle, which is to say, a verdict of permanent incapacity. For this, I have received substantial compensation. I do not examine my conscience on this matter, as it has already been decided. Eleanor set the letter down. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "He knew I could get better. He knew it was temporary." "Yes," Margaret said from across the room. "He knew, and he and Charles knew, and they—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. The baby stirred in her arm, sensing something in the shift of her breathing, and she automatically tightened her hold and said softly, automatically, "Shh, it's all right." Because some part of her could be furious and still keep a child calm apparently, because you do what you have to do. She looked up at Judith Crane. "What do I do with this?" she asked. "That," Judith said, "is where we need to discuss your position very carefully." She sat down across from Eleanor and folded her hands on the table and looked at her with the measured seriousness of someone who is about to say difficult things and has no intention of dressing them up. "You are still legally Nathaniel Ashford's wife," Judith began. "The letter he gave you was a formal request to withdraw from the household, not a legal dissolution of the marriage. That requires court proceedings. Which means, at this moment, you have standing. You have legal standing. Social standing. You are Eleanor Ashford, wife of the most prominent landowner in this county, and that name still belongs to you." She paused. "However, your position is fragile. You are in a farmhouse off the Charlottesville Road with a newborn son and no witnesses to the birth beyond Margaret, myself, Annie Colton, and her husband, Charles Ashford. When he learns of this child's existence, and he will learn of it, will move quickly. He will question the paternity. He will question the legitimacy. He will do everything in his power to ensure that this boy is never recognized as a legal heir." Eleanor listened. She did not look away. She did not let herself flinch. "What do I need?" she asked. "Documentation," Judith said. "A legal record of the birth witnessed and signed. Margaret can provide the midwifery attestation. Joseph and Annie Colton can witness. That needs to happen today or tomorrow at the latest." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "And then you need to decide what you want." "What I want," Eleanor repeated. "Yes, because there are different paths from here, Mrs. Ashford, and they lead to different places. You could take your son and disappear. Change your name, build a quiet life somewhere. Charles Ashford cannot reach you. Many women in your position have done exactly that and lived decently enough." Judith's voice was entirely without judgment. "Or you can stay. You can fight. You can take what we have here and build a case and use your legal standing as his wife and force this into the light. But that path is not safe, and it is not easy, and it will require you to do things that are going to be very hard. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the yard, a bird called twice and then went silent. Eleanor looked down at her son. He had his father's hair. She had thought it that first night, and she thought it again. Now the dark, slightly too long hair that Nathaniel was always meaning to cut and never quite getting around to. Her son had it already, that same quality of determined unruliness, and looking at it now was a complicated experience. She thought about Nathaniel. She thought about him specifically at 31, in the first year of their marriage, when the land had gone through a bad season, and they had sat up 4 nights in a row going through the accounts together at the kitchen table, and he had looked at her at 2 in the morning on the 4th night and said very quietly, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Elle." And she had said, "You'd manage. Men always manage." And he had said, "No. I mean, I specifically wouldn't know what to do. You see things I don't see." She had not told him how much that meant to her. She had simply picked up her pen and gone back to the accounts. He had trusted her then. Something had happened between then and now. Something had been done to that trust, not broken by carelessness, but carefully, deliberately chipped away by a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had years to do it. She looked up. "I need to know something," she said. "Not about the legal case, something else." Judith waited. "Nathaniel," Eleanor said. "My husband. Is there any possibility, any evidence at all that he knew that he was part of it?" Judith and Margaret exchanged a brief look. "No," Judith said, and she said it without hesitation, which was somehow more convincing than if she had considered it. "What I have found suggests that Charles worked specifically around Nathaniel. The payments were through a separate account, not the estate account. The meetings with Beaumont occurred when Nathaniel was traveling. Charles was careful to appear always as the grieving uncle, sympathetic, patient." She paused. "Nathaniel was deceived Mrs. Ashford, completely and deliberately. That does not excuse the choices he made with the information he was given, but he was not a participant." Eleanor absorbed this. It did not make her feel better exactly, but it settled something. "Then I'm not going anywhere," she said. Neither woman looked surprised. "I am not going to disappear," Eleanor continued. Her voice was quiet, but there was a quality to it now that had not been there before, something set and final. "I am not going to take my son and become invisible because it is easier for everyone. I am not going to let Charles Ashford win by default." She looked at Judith directly. "Tell me what I need to do." Judith Crane almost smiled. "First," she said, picking up her pen, "we document the birth." They did it that afternoon around the kitchen table. Margaret's attestation, the Coltons' signatures, the date and time and particulars, recorded in Judith's careful legal hand on paper that would be copied 3 times and sent to 3 different places for safekeeping. Eleanor's son was given his name that afternoon too. Sitting in Annie Colton's kitchen, with the summer heat pressing at the windows and the smell of biscuits in the air. Because Annie Colton believed that significant moments should be attended by food. William Nathaniel Ashford. She gave him his father's name as the middle name, not out of sentiment, or not only out of sentiment, but because sentiment and strategy were not always different things, and a boy named William Nathaniel Ashford, born in the summer of 1817, and witnessed by 4 people whose names were now on a legal document, was a harder thing to erase than a rumor. "You've thought this through," Margaret observed. "I've had 3 days," Eleanor said. 2 weeks passed. They were the strangest 2 weeks of Eleanor's life, and that was a significant thing to say, given that the weeks immediately prior had included being dismissed from her own home and giving birth in a stranger's house. She had no contact with Ashford Estate. She received no letters, though she had not expected to, as Nathaniel did not know precisely where she was. She sent none either, because the time was not right, and she knew it, and the knowledge required a patience that cost her something. Judith worked quickly. She had connections. Eleanor had not expected other women, mostly widows and wives of professional men, who had maintained the kind of practical networks that men never thought to attribute to women. Letters went to Richmond. A deposition was taken from a clerk at Weston and Carr, whose name Judith declined to share, but whose testimony when reduced to writing was devastating. a physician in Charlottesville, one recommended by Margaret, old and respected, and entirely independent of the Ashford family's sphere of influence, examined Eleanor, and provided his own attestation of her current health, and by inference, the likelihood of her previous condition having been misrepresented. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in late July, Judith received a letter back from someone in Richmond. She read it at the kitchen table, while Eleanor nursed the baby, and Annie Colton pretended to be busy at the stove. Then she set it down, and looked up, and the expression on her face made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "Charles Ashford was in Richmond last week," Judith said. "For what purpose?" "He met with a man named Percy Hollis. Hollis is an attorney, not a reputable one, but a functional one, who specializes in estate matters." Judith's voice was very level. "He was seen entering Hollis's office with documents that my contact describes as relating to the Ashford estate succession." The kitchen was very quiet. "He is moving," Eleanor said. "He is moving," Judith agreed. "Which means our timeline has changed. We cannot wait any longer." Eleanor looked down at William. He had fallen asleep mid-feeding, as infants do, with the boneless total surrender of someone who has no concept of urgency or threat. His face was entirely peaceful. She thought with a sudden fierce clarity that she would do anything, absolutely anything, within the boundaries of what she could live with, to keep it that way. "What do we do?" she asked. "We go to Nathaniel," Judith said. Everything in Eleanor went still. "Not to reconcile," Judith added quickly, reading her expression. "Not for any sentimental reason. For a strategic one. Charles is preparing to challenge the estate succession. To do that, he needs Nathaniel either dead, incapacitated, or willing. And the fastest way to stop him is to put Nathaniel in possession of the truth before Charles has a chance to control the narrative." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "You are still his wife. That child is his legitimate heir. If Nathaniel knows what Charles has done, if he sees the documents, here's the evidence, he can act. He has the standing to stop this in a way that you alone do not." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. She thought about what it would mean to walk back into Nathaniel's life. Not the way she had left, not as someone being sent away, but as the person who had to walk in with the evidence of his uncle's betrayal in one hand and their son in the other arm, and stand in front of a man who had failed her and say, "You were lied to. Here is the proof. Now what are you going to do about it?" She thought about how much easier it would be to simply not, to take William and Judith's legal documents and find a place far enough away that Charles Ashford's scheming could not reach her. To build a smaller, quieter, safer life. To let Nathaniel live with what he had chosen, and let Charles have what he was maneuvering for, and simply remove herself from the entire machinery of it. She could do that. She knew she could do that. She was Eleanor Whitmore before she was Eleanor Ashford, and Eleanor Whitmore had managed to survive perfectly well on intelligence and determination, without the aid of any estate. But William Nathaniel Ashford was sleeping in her arms, and he was an heir, whether anyone acknowledged it or not, and he deserved what was his, and his father deserved the truth, and Charles Ashford deserved to be stopped, not just for her sake, but for everyone whose life that man had quietly arranged to suit his purposes. She looked at Judith. "When do we leave?" she asked. They left the next morning. Eleanor rose before dawn fed. William dressed in the simple gray dress that Annie Colton had quietly altered to fit her over the past 2 weeks, and braided her hair with the same hands that had written household accounts and held her husband in the dark, and now held a sleeping child and a folder of documents that could shatter a life. She said goodbye to the Coltons at the door. Annie held her, which was brief but fierce, the kind of embrace that says more than the words the woman cannot find. Joseph shook her hand, and then looked uncomfortable about it, and then looked at the baby and said gruffly, "He's a good-looking boy," which Eleanor understood as the kindest possible version of everything he could not articulate. She got into the carriage that Judith had arranged. Not an Ashford carriage, not a recognizable vehicle, and she held William against her chest, and she looked out the window as the Colton farmhouse disappeared behind a curve in the road. She did not feel ready. She was not sure readiness was available to her. But she was going anyway, because the women she admired had always been the ones who went anyway. The road to Ashford Estate would take most of the day. She had time to think. She thought about what Nathaniel would look like when he saw her. She thought about whether he would look relieved or guilty, or something worse, something like alarm, the alarm of a man who realizes too late that the thing he dismissed was not as easily dismissed as he believed. She thought about what she would say first and decided she would not plan it, because planned speeches delivered to real people in real rooms always fell apart on contact with the actual moment. She thought about Charles Ashford, his face, his careful sympathy, the way he had always been so present in the painful moments of the last 2 years. She had never liked him. She had always felt a coolness toward him that she had privately chastised herself for, telling herself it was uncharitable, telling herself he was Nathaniel's family, and she should extend grace to family. Now she understood that her instincts had been correct, and her charity had been misapplied, and she made herself a quiet promise that she would trust her instincts more going forward. She thought about what would happen if this went wrong. If Nathaniel, faced with the choice between the evidence in front of him and the years of careful doubt his uncle had cultivated, chose doubt again. If he looked at her and William and the documents and still somehow found a way to believe Charles over her. She let herself sit with that fear for exactly 5 minutes. Then she put it away, because William was awake and looking at her with that unfocused, wondering gaze of a 3-week-old infant who finds the whole of existence fascinating, and she could not afford to spend his early life in fear of what might happen. "It's all right," she told him quietly, though he did not understand words yet, and would not for a considerable time. "Whatever happens, it's going to be all right. I promise you that." He kicked his feet against her arm. She took that as agreement. They arrived at the outer edge of Ashford estate land in the late afternoon, when the heat had begun to ease slightly, and the light had that thick golden quality that made even familiar things look different. Eleanor recognized the fence line, the particular angle of the hills, the distant shape of the tobacco fields. She had ridden these roads on horseback 100 times. She had walked portions of them in autumn, when the leaves were down and the air was cold and sharp, and Nathaniel would walk beside her with his hands in his pockets, and they would not always talk because they had been comfortable enough with each other to walk without filling the silence. She remembered that. She looked at the fields. She thought, "I helped build this. I watched 3 harvests come in from this land. I sat with this man through his father's death and a failed spring planting, and 2 years of being told I was broken. I am not a visitor here. I am not a woman who left and is returning as a stranger. I am Eleanor Ashford, and I am coming back for what is mine, not the house, not the title, not even the man necessarily. The truth. She was coming back for the truth." The carriage turned up the long drive toward the house, and Eleanor sat straight and held her son and did not allow herself to look away. She had not looked back when she left. She would not look away when she returned. The carriage stopped at the front of Ashford Estate, and for exactly 3 seconds, Eleanor did not move. She sat with William against her chest and her folder of documents on the seat beside her, and she breathed in once slowly, the way a person breathes before stepping into cold water. Then she handed William to Judith, who took him with the careful competence of a woman who has handled fragile things before, and Eleanor stepped down from the carriage onto the drive of the house she had left 4 weeks ago, with 2 bags and no future. Her feet knew the ground. That was the strange part. Her body remembered this place even when her mind was still catching up. Hector came around from the side of the house first. He stopped dead when he saw her. His mouth opened and then closed again. "Miss Eleanor," he said. And then immediately his eyes went to the bundle in Judith's arms inside the carriage, and his face did something that was almost wonder. "Is that?" "It is," Eleanor said. "Is Mr. Ashford in the house?" Hector nodded, still staring at the carriage. "Is Mr. Charles Ashford also in the house?" Something shifted in Hector's face at that. Something careful. "Yes, ma'am. He's been here most of the past week. Says he's helping Mr. Nathaniel manage some business matters." Eleanor felt the information land precisely where she expected it. Charles was already here, already installed, already working. "Thank you, Hector," she said, and she walked up the front steps. She did not knock. This was still her house, and she had decided on the carriage ride that she would conduct herself accordingly. Not aggressively, not as someone making a point, but simply as a woman who belongs somewhere and moves through it as such. She opened the front door and walked in. Mrs. Graves was in the hallway. The housekeeper froze. For one full second, she simply stood there with a stack of folded linens in her arms and her mouth slightly open, and then something in her face cracked open in a way Eleanor had never seen from that carefully neutral woman, and Mrs. Graves set the linens down on the hall table and crossed to Eleanor and took both of her hands. She did not say anything for a moment. She just held Eleanor's hands and looked at her. "You came back," she said finally. "I came back," Eleanor agreed. "He's in the study." Mrs. Graves's voice dropped slightly. "Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Charles is with him. They've been in there for 2 hours." "I know." Eleanor pressed the older woman's hands once and released them. "Where is the study key?" Mrs. Graves blinked. "The study is not locked. The key to the exterior study door, the one that locks from the outside." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "The one that Mr. Charles uses when he wants to ensure their conversations are not interrupted." A pause. A brief one. Then Mrs. Graves reached into her apron pocket and produced a key. Eleanor took it. She walked down the hall. Behind her, she heard Judith come through the front door. Heard the small sounds of William stirring. Heard Mrs. Graves make a sharp, soft sound that might have been a sob, or might have been something closer to relief. She did not turn around. She kept walking. The study door was, as Mrs. Graves had said, unlocked from the inside. Eleanor could hear voices, Nathaniel's lower and measured and Charles's, which had always had a quality of studied reasonableness that she now understood as performance. She could not hear the words. She stood outside the door for one moment. She put her hand on the handle. She went in. The room went silent, as if she had cut a wire. Nathaniel was behind the desk. Charles was in the chair across from him, a glass of something amber on the table beside him, papers spread between them. Both men looked at her. The expressions were entirely different. Nathaniel's face went through 4 things in about 2 seconds. Shock, and then something raw and unguarded that she did not yet know how to interpret, and then a complicated grief, and then a stillness that was him pulling himself back under control. He rose from his chair without appearing to decide to. He simply stood up the way your body moves when something has short-circuited the deliberate part of your mind. "Eleanor," he said. Just her name. Nothing else. Charles Ashford recovered faster. He was a man practiced in recovery. She understood that now. He turned in his chair with an expression of measured concern. Not surprise, not alarm, not any of the things a guilty man might feel, because Charles was too careful for that. "My dear Eleanor," he said, his voice warm with something that she now recognized as crafted warmth, the warmth of a man who has been performing sincerity for so long, he has perhaps forgotten there is a difference. "What a relief to see you well. We heard you had taken ill on the road. Nathaniel has been worried." "Has he?" Eleanor said. She did not look at Charles. She looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression that was very hard to read and very hard to look away from. "Eleanor," he said again, and this time there was more in it, a question, and underneath the question something that sounded like apology, and underneath that something that sounded like a man who has spent 4 weeks being alone with what he had done and was not comfortable with the company. "I need to speak with you," Eleanor said. "Alone." Of course," Charles said, beginning to rise with every appearance of gracious accommodation. "I can certainly." "Sit down, Charles," Eleanor said. He stopped. She looked at him then, and she let him see that she was not frightened of him, had not been frightened of him, had perhaps never quite been frightened of the right things, in the right proportions, and was now correcting that. She held his gaze until he sat back down. Then she looked at Nathaniel. "Lock the door," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked to the study door and turned the key. Eleanor set her folder of documents on the desk. She did not open it yet. She stood on the opposite side of the desk from Nathaniel, and she looked at him, and she said evenly, "I have a son." The room was so quiet, she could hear the clock on the mantel. Nathaniel went very still. His eyes searched her face. "Your son," she said. "Born 4 weeks ago in a farmhouse off the Charlottesville Road. attended by the midwife Margaret Hale, and witnessed by Joseph and Annie Colton. Documented and signed and sent to 3 separate locations for legal safekeeping, because I was advised very early to take precautions. She paused. His name is William Nathaniel Ashford. Nathaniel sat down. Not the way people sit in chairs, more the way people sit when their legs simply decline to continue functioning. He put one hand flat on the desk. "That's not possible," he said. It was barely above a whisper. "The doctors said—" "The doctors lied," Eleanor said. And that was when Charles Ashford stood up. He moved quickly for a man who always moved with such deliberate ease. He stood up, and his face shifted not into rage. Nothing so uncalculated as rage, but into something cold and decisive that Eleanor had never seen there before, because he had never needed to show it to her before. "Nathaniel," Charles said, and his voice had changed, shed the warmth like a coat he'd decided he no longer needed. "Whatever this woman is claiming—" "This woman," Eleanor said, "has bank records." Charles stopped. Eleanor opened the folder. She spread the first document on the desk between them, the banking record from Weston and Carr, the transfer dated October 1815, the name James B. Beaumont, the amount $300. She set it down with the flat precision of someone who has been waiting a long time to make a particular motion and is not going to rush it now that the moment has arrived. Nathaniel looked at the document. His brow pulled together. "That is a bank record," Eleanor said, "from the private firm where your uncle maintains a personal account. In October of 1815, $300 was transferred from that account to Dr. James Beaumont, 2 months before Beaumont delivered his report on my condition." She set down the second document. "And here is the subsequent payment. $200 December 1815. 2 weeks after you were told I could never give you a child." Nathaniel looked from the documents to her face, and then to Charles and back. Charles had gone very still. The performance of warmth was entirely gone now. In its place was something stripped and cold. The face of a man calculating his next move with the rapid, unhurried precision of someone who has been in difficult situations before and survived them. "These documents prove nothing beyond a financial transaction," Charles said. "Beaumont was recommended to me by an associate. I may have assisted with his fee. There is nothing improper in—" "There is also a journal entry," Eleanor said. She set down the third document. She watched Charles's face. The calculation that had been running behind his eyes stuttered. Just for a moment, just one fraction of a second, where she could see that he had not known about the journal, had not anticipated, it was performing rapid internal arithmetic about what it might contain. That fraction of a second told her everything she needed to know about his guilt. Nathaniel picked up the journal pages. Eleanor watched him read. She watched his face go through the same journey the words had taken her on in the farmhouse kitchen, in Annie Colton's lamplight, the dawning, and then the solidifying, and then the thing underneath that was not just anger, but something more foundational. Something like the feeling of the ground moving under your feet. He read it once. He looked up at Charles. He read it again. He set it down. "Nathaniel," Charles said. His voice had shifted again, not back to warmth, but to something else, something lower and more personal. "You need to think carefully. This woman has been away from this house for a month. She arrives with documents that anyone could have prepared, with claims that cannot be verified, with a child whose origins—" "His origins," Eleanor said very quietly, "are documented by a midwife with 37 years of practice, 2 adult witnesses, a legal attestation signed and dated, and currently in the possession of a solicitor in Charlottesville, a copy with Margaret Hale, and a copy sent to my mother's cousin in Philadelphia." She held Charles's gaze. "You would need to discredit all of them simultaneously, Charles. I made certain of that." A beat of silence. Nathaniel was looking at his uncle. Eleanor had not allowed herself to think too carefully on the road here about what that moment would look like. She had tried to prepare for many versions of it. She had not quite prepared for the version where Nathaniel looked at Charles Ashford with an expression she could not name because it was too many things at once, the specific devastation of a man looking at someone he trusted and seeing the thing behind the trust for the first time. "You paid him," Nathaniel said. His voice was entirely flat. "Nathaniel, You paid him to tell me my wife was barren." "The situation was more complex then. Did you or did you not?" Nathaniel said, and his voice was very quiet and very controlled, in the way that is not calmness, but is the thing that lives right next to calmness in a man who is genuinely furious. "Pay James Beaumont $500 to falsify a medical report about my wife." The room was completely silent. Charles straightened. He made one more attempt, one final performance, this one stripped of warmth and pretense, and resorting instead to the most basic available tool, which was authority. "I did what was necessary to protect this family's future," he said. "You were wasting years on a woman who—" Nathaniel moved around the desk. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hands. He crossed the space between himself and his uncle in 3 steps, and he stopped very close to him, and he said very quietly, "Get out of my house." Charles looked at him. "Nathaniel, if you will simply—" "Get out of my house," Nathaniel said again, exactly the same volume, same flatness, same absolute lack of anything negotiable in it. "And understand that I will be speaking with a solicitor before this week is out. And understand that whatever business arrangements you have made, under the assumption that this estate would pass to you, are arrangements I will be reviewing in their entirety." He held his uncle's gaze. "And understand that if you have done anything that I do not yet know about, I will find it." Charles looked at Eleanor. It was the look of a man making a rapid calculation about whether there was anything left to salvage. She met his eyes and did not blink, and whatever he saw there settled the calculation for him, because he picked up his glass, set it down again, picked up his hat from the table, and walked to the study door. He paused with his hand on the lock. "You are making a serious mistake," he said to Nathaniel. "I have been making serious mistakes for 2 years," Nathaniel said. "I am attempting to stop." Charles unlocked the door and walked out. The room held its silence for a long moment after he left. Eleanor did not move. She stood on her side of the desk, with her hands resting lightly on the folder of documents, and she let the silence be what it was, because she had said what she came to say, and delivered what she came to deliver, and whatever came next was going to require more than a few words. Nathaniel turned from the door. He looked at her. He looked at the documents on the desk, and then at her, and then at the door through which Judith was presumably waiting in the hallway with William, and then back at Eleanor. "You have a son," he said. Not a question this time. Something different, something that was starting to move through the shock and become real to him, the way very large things become real slowly and in stages. "We have a son," Eleanor said carefully. "That is a factual statement, not an invitation." His jaw moved. He nodded once, as if he understood the distinction and accepted it. Is he well? Are you?" "We are both well," she said. "Margaret Hale is an exceptional midwife." He nodded again. He looked like a man standing in the aftermath of an explosion, which was, she supposed, roughly accurate. Everything he thought he had known about the last 2 years had just been taken apart and rearranged into a different shape, and the rearranged shape was much worse than the original had appeared to be. "Eleanor," he said and stopped. "Don't," she said. "Not unkindly." "Not yet. I'm not ready for that conversation yet. There is too much between here and there." He accepted that too. "Can I see him?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about saying no. The word was right there available, and she had more than enough reason to use it. She thought about what it would mean to hand her son to the man who had handed her a dismissal letter and sent her away in a carriage with 2 bags. She thought about William, who had his father's hair and his father's stubborn mouth, and who was 3 weeks old and entirely without opinions about forgiveness or its appropriate timeline. "Yes," she said, "you can see him." She went to the door and opened it. Judith was in the hallway exactly where Eleanor had known she would be. William was awake, looking around with the watchful focus of an infant who has decided the world is interesting. Judith handed him to Eleanor without a word, and Eleanor carried him back into the study. She crossed the room and held him out to Nathaniel. Nathaniel took him. He took him with the careful, slightly panicked hands of a man who has not held an infant before and is profoundly aware of his own inexperience. He got him settled against his chest and then went very still, looking down. He did not say anything for a long time. Eleanor watched his face. She watched the moment when it arrived. The moment when the fact of this child stopped being information and became something else. Something that bypassed language and went straight to some part of a person that does not require words. She watched Nathaniel's face change in a way that she had never quite seen it change before, even in 6 years of watching this man. His hand came up and very carefully with one finger touched the top of William's head. "He's so small," he said. "High as a month old," Eleanor said. "He is proportionate. He has your—" Nathaniel stopped. "He has your around the eyes." "He has your hair," Eleanor said. Nathaniel looked up. Their eyes met over the top of their son's head, and Eleanor held that gaze and did not let herself feel too much about it yet, because there was still a great deal that needed to happen, and she was not going to let one moment, however significant, collapse the space that needed to be between them right now. "I failed you," Nathaniel said. It was very simple. No preamble, no context, no softening. "Yes," she said, just as simply. I don't know how to—" He stopped. He looked back down at William. "I don't know what I'm asking you to. I don't have the right to ask you for anything." "No," she agreed. "You don't." He nodded. "Then I'm not asking," he said. I'm telling you, I failed you. I believed what I wanted to believe, or what was easiest to believe because the alternative was harder. And I sent you away. And you—" His voice faltered for the first time. "You went through all of this alone." "Not entirely alone," Eleanor said. "Margaret was there. And the Coltons. And Judith." She paused. "People are kinder than you expect sometimes when you actually need them." He absorbed that. She took a breath and said the thing she had decided on the long carriage ride that she would say. "I am not here to reconcile," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I am here because Charles is moving against this estate, and my son's birthright and stopping him requires your standing and my evidence working together, and that is a practical necessity. I am also here because you deserve to know you have a son, and William deserves to know his father, and those are separate necessities." Nathaniel listened to all of this. "And beyond the practical necessity," he said quietly. "Is there anything beyond that?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. He looked back at William. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." It might have been the most truthful conversation they had ever had. They were still standing there, Nathaniel with William. Eleanor watching them both with the complicated expression of a woman holding 6 years of love and 4 weeks of fury in the same hands when Mrs. Graves knocked on the open study door. "I beg your pardon," she said, and her voice had something in it that made Eleanor look up sharply. "There is a man here. He arrived at the back of the property 20 minutes ago, and Hector just came to find me. He says—" She stopped. "Mrs. Graves," Eleanor said. "What is it?" "He says he has a message from Mr. Charles Ashford," Mrs. Graves said, "and he is asking to speak to the master alone." The room shifted. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. He looked at her over William's head. "Charles left not 20 minutes ago," Nathaniel said, and his voice had gone very careful. "He sent someone ahead." "He had someone waiting," Eleanor said. "He came here prepared for things to go wrong." She looked at Mrs. Graves. "Where is this man now?" "Hector has him at the kitchen door." "Keep him there." Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. "Don't speak to him alone." "Eleanor." "Nathaniel." She held his gaze. "He came prepared. That means he anticipated losing today's conversation and planned a next move before he even sat down in that chair. Whatever message this man is carrying, Charles does not want you to hear it with me present. Which means you need to hear it with me present." A pause. She could see him considering it the old habit of making decisions without her, the one that had been cultivated so carefully over 2 years of his uncle's influence. She watched him push against it. "Bring him in here," Nathaniel said to Mrs. Graves. The man who appeared in the study doorway was young, not more than 25, with the nondescript appearance of someone hired specifically for nondescription. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the infant. His expression told her he had not been briefed on the infant. "Mr. Ashford," he said to Nathaniel. "I am Mr. Ashford," Nathaniel said. "This is Mrs. Ashford. You may say what you came to say." The young man hesitated. "My instructions were—" "I'm aware of your instructions. Say what you came to say." Another hesitation. Then he reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. "Mr. Charles Ashford requests that you review this document and consider carefully before taking any action against him." He held out the envelope. "He says you will understand once you have read it." Nathaniel took it. He opened it. Eleanor watched his face. She had become over the last 4 weeks very good at watching Nathaniel's face, or perhaps she had always been good at it, and had simply not applied the skill as deliberately as she was applying it now. She saw him read the first line and go still. She saw him read further, and something tighten around his eyes. She saw him reach the end and stand for a moment with the letter hanging at his side. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her. There was something in his expression she could not immediately place, not fear exactly, but adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man who has just discovered a deeper layer to a problem he thought he was beginning to understand. "My father's will," he said. "Or rather, a clause in my father's will that Charles claims was added in a codicil 2 months before he died." He held the letter out to her. "A clause that gives Charles a 1/3 stake in the Ashford estate, if the primary heir dies or is incapacitated without a legitimate son acknowledged by the family prior to the holder's 40th birthday." Eleanor took the letter. She read it. "Nathaniel," she said slowly. "When do you turn 40? "October," he said. "October of this year." The young man at the door was trying very hard to look invisible. "Get out," Eleanor said to him without looking up from the letter. He got out. She read the clause again. It was written in precise legal language that she had not had occasion to understand before meeting Judith Crane, but understood now reasonably well. She understood the date. She understood the specificity of the phrase acknowledged by the family. She understood with the cold clarity of a woman who has spent 4 weeks being educated in how men like Charles operated exactly what this was. "He added this clause after your father was dying," she said. "Or he altered an existing clause. He needed to be certain that even if you had a child, even if somehow I proved him wrong, he would have grounds to dispute the legitimacy, the timing, the acknowledgement. He needed me to turn 40 without a son I had publicly claimed," Nathaniel said. "He needed 3 more months," Eleanor said. "He has been building toward 3 more months." She set the letter on the desk. She picked up her folder. She found what she was looking for, the copy of William's birth documentation, the one with all 4 signatures, the legal attestation, the date, July 3, 1817. Nathaniel Ashford would turn 40 in October. William Nathaniel Ashford existed and was documented as of July. The mathematics were straightforward. "He is too late," she said. Nathaniel looked at the documentation. He looked at his son still in his arms. He looked at Eleanor. "The codicil itself may still be contested," she said. "Judith will need to look at this. If it was added while your father was in a diminished state, if there are witnesses who can speak to his condition at the time, this is not resolved simply by the birth date." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "But it changes things. It changes everything," Eleanor said. "And Charles knows it." That message was not a threat. It was desperation. A man with a solid position does not send messengers to the back door. She pulled the letter toward her and looked at it one more time, and then she looked up at Nathaniel, and she said with the precision of a woman who has spent 4 weeks being afraid of nothing because there was no room left for fear, "We need Judith in here, now. Judith Crane." When Mrs. Graves brought her in, looked at the codicil letter for exactly 90 seconds. Then she set it down and looked at Eleanor and said, "How did you know to bring me today?" "I didn't know about this," Eleanor said. "I came for the other reasons." "Yes, but—" Judith looked at the letter again, then at the birth documentation. "If you had come even 2 weeks later, if this had been settled before William's birth was documented—" "It wasn't," Eleanor said. "No." Judith sat back. She looked at Nathaniel. Mr. Ashford, the codicil is potentially valid. Its validity will depend on questions about your father's mental state at signing, which we can investigate. But your wife is correct that the birth documentation predates your 40th birthday by a comfortable margin, which means the primary clause, legitimate son acknowledged before that date, can be satisfied. She paused. What I need from you as soon as possible is a public acknowledgement. Not just in this room, not just among us. A public recorded witnessed acknowledgement that William Nathaniel Ashford is your legitimate heir. Nathaniel did not hesitate. Tell me how, he said. You will need to stand before witnesses, and I mean the community, not just household staff. The local magistrate's office will need to record it. A notice in the county records. She looked at him steadily. And I would recommend you do it before Charles has the opportunity to file any preemptive claim, which means within the week. Within the week, Nathaniel repeated. Tomorrow would be better, Judith said. He looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. 6 years of marriage, 2 years of deliberate erosion, 4 weeks alone in a farmhouse, a carriage ride back to a house she had sworn not to look back at. She thought about William, who was now asleep against his father's chest, with the total serenity of an infant who has no awareness that his existence has been the subject of a property dispute. She thought about what it meant to stand beside this man in front of witnesses and acknowledge this family. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Not a decision about their marriage or their future or the complicated private space between them that would take much longer than a day to navigate. Just the truth. Standing publicly in the truth. I will be there, Eleanor said. Nathaniel exhaled. Outside, the summer afternoon was going gold, going amber, the heat beginning to ease toward evening. Somewhere on the road from Ashford Estate, Charles Ashford was in a carriage doing his own calculations, running his own numbers, preparing his own next move. Eleanor did not underestimate him. She did not think for a moment that a man who had spent 2 years building a scheme would abandon it because one afternoon had gone badly. But one afternoon had in fact gone very badly for him, and tomorrow would go worse. She looked at Judith. What else do we need? Judith opened her own folder. Sit down, she said. We have work to do. Eleanor sat down. She pulled a piece of paper toward her and picked up a pen. For the first time in 6 years, she was sitting at the desk in this study, not as Nathaniel's wife managing his household, but as Eleanor Ashford, the woman who held the documents that could end his uncle's schemes and secure her son's future, and had arrived here not because she was sent or summoned, but because she had decided. There was a difference. She was only beginning to understand how large a difference it was. She put pen to paper. They worked until the candles were lit. They worked until well past midnight. Judith spread everything across the study desk, the banking records, the journal pages, the birth documentation, the codicil letter, and she organized them with the methodical precision of a woman building a case, brick by brick. Nathaniel sat across from her. Eleanor sat beside her. William slept in the small basket Mrs. Graves had produced from somewhere in the house, the kind of practical magic that good housekeepers perform without being asked. Nobody talked about the marriage. Nobody talked about the 4 weeks. Nobody talked about the letter on the vanity or the carriage or the 2 bags. There was a silent mutual agreement that those things existed and would need to be addressed, and were not going to be addressed tonight, because tonight had a specific and urgent purpose, and everything else would have to wait its turn. What they talked about was Charles. He will not sit still, Judith said, not for the first time tapping the codicil letter with one finger. A man who prepared this level of contingency does not absorb a single bad afternoon and retreat. He will move tonight or tomorrow morning, and he will move on 2 fronts simultaneously. What 2 fronts? Nathaniel asked. The legal front, Judith said. He will attempt to file a preemptive claim with Percy Hollis, the attorney in Richmond, challenging the legitimacy of the birth on the grounds that Eleanor was absent from the household for the relevant period. He will argue the child's paternity is unverifiable. She paused. And the social front. He will begin talking. To neighbors, to business associates, to anyone whose opinion carries weight in this county. He will plant doubt before you have the chance to establish fact. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He wouldn't. Eleanor looked at him. He caught her expression and stopped. Something moved through his face, the recognition of a man understanding in real time that the portrait he has carried of someone for 30 years has just been replaced with an accurate one, and the accurate one is considerably uglier. He would, Nathaniel said quietly, correcting himself. He already has, Eleanor said. That message he sent here tonight, the young man at the kitchen door, that was not the only message he sent this evening. I would wager considerably on that. Judith nodded. Which is why the morning matters more than anything else. Mr. Ashford, I need you to understand what I am asking when I say public acknowledgement. I do not mean a document filed quietly with a clerk. I mean you standing in a place where people see you with your wife beside you and your son in your arms, and saying clearly and without qualification that this child is yours and his mother is your wife. She held his gaze. I mean the kind of statement that travels faster than Charles's rumors because it is something people want to believe. People want to believe it, Nathaniel said. People in this county have watched your family for 2 generations, Judith said. They respected your father. Most of them like you, and most of them. She glanced briefly at Eleanor. Most of them thought what happened to your wife was a hard thing and said so privately, even if they said nothing publicly. Eleanor had not known that. She sat with it for a moment. Where? Nathaniel asked. Where do I do this? The Sunday service is in 3 days, Judith said. That is too long. The market in the county seat is tomorrow morning. Half the county will be there before 9 o'clock. Nathaniel looked at Eleanor. She understood what he was asking without him asking it, whether she would stand beside him in front of people who had watched her be sent away. Whether she would do that not for him, but for William, for the public record, for the practical necessity of it. She had already decided. I will be there, she said. Same words as before, same answer. He nodded. He looked back at Judith. What time? 7 o'clock, Judith said. Before Charles has the chance to arrive first. They continued working. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, Mrs. Graves appeared at the door with coffee and biscuits that nobody had asked for. Set them on the side table, without a word, looked at Eleanor for one long moment, with an expression that contained approximately 40 years of female solidarity compressed into a single glance, and withdrew. Eleanor drank the coffee. She watched Nathaniel across the desk, the way he was bent over the documents, reading and rereading, asking Judith precise questions, making notes in the margin of his own paper, with the focused attention of a man who has decided to understand something completely and will not stop until he does. She had watched him work like this before in the early years, over the estate accounts, over the harvest reports. She had always found it one of his more reliable qualities, the capacity for thorough attention when something genuinely mattered to him. She noted that she still found it reliable. She did not know what to do with that information yet. At 1:30, Judith declared the immediate work done. The documents were organized. The plan for the morning was set. There were letters to be sent to 2 people in Richmond before dawn. Judith would write them herself tonight at the small desk in the guest room where Mrs. Graves had installed her. Sleep, Judith told Eleanor firmly. You have an infant. Sleep when you can. I'm not tired, Eleanor said. Judith gave her the look of a woman who has raised children and attended 200 births and has no patience for that particular category of nonsense. Eleanor went to bed. She lay in the room that Mrs. Graves had prepared for her. Not the room she had shared with Nathaniel, which she had not asked for and had not been offered, but the large guest room at the end of the corridor with the window that faced the east and would catch the morning light early. William's basket was beside the bed. She could hear him breathing. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling, and she did not sleep for a long time. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about standing in the county market with Nathaniel beside her and William in her arms, in front of people who knew her face and knew what had happened to her and would form their own conclusions about what her presence meant. She thought about the specific courage that required not the dramatic courage of confronting someone directly, which she had already done and found she was capable of, but the quieter and in some ways harder courage of being seen. She had been hidden for 4 weeks. She had been the woman at the Colton farmhouse, the woman in the borrowed room, the woman with no last name and no public face. There had been a certain protection in that, she realized. A certain freedom. Tomorrow she would be Eleanor Ashford again in public, in full view, and people would look at her the way people look at women whose private lives have become common knowledge. Some of them would be kind, some of them would not. And she would have to stand in all of that and be still. She pressed her hand flat on the mattress beside her. She thought, I have given birth alone in a stranger's house. I have read a journal entry proving my husband's uncle paid a doctor to destroy my marriage. I have walked back into this house and confronted that uncle to his face. I have sat at my husband's desk and built a legal case in a single evening. I can stand in a market. She slept. William woke her at 5, which was early enough that the house was still dark and quiet. She fed him and held him in the dark and listened to the summer morning. Beginning outside the window. Birds first, then light. Then the sound of someone in the kitchen stoking the fire. She dressed carefully, not to impress, not to perform. She dressed the way you dress when you know you are going to be looked at and you want the looking to find nothing it can use against you. Her best summer dress, the deep blue one that she had brought in her 2 bags because she had packed practically and not sentimentally, and the blue dress was her most reliable garment. Her hair pinned properly, her back straight. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like Eleanor Ashford. She picked up William and went downstairs. Nathaniel was already in the kitchen. This surprised her. She had not expected him to be up this early, had expected to navigate the morning with Mrs. Graves and Judith, and perhaps eat something before he appeared. But he was there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an expression that told her he had not slept at all, and he looked up when she came in and stood up, which was an automatic courtesy that she noticed and did not comment on. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. A pause. "He takes after you more close up," Nathaniel said, looking at William. "Around the mouth." "You said that last night." "I know." He looked at his coffee. "I keep noticing it." Mrs. Graves appeared from the pantry and produced breakfast with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided that the best contribution she can make to this particular morning is to ensure that everyone in this kitchen has eaten before they face whatever they are about to face. They ate largely in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence which surprised Eleanor. It was the silence of people who have said the important things and are resting before the next necessary thing. Judith came down at 6:15 with her letters already written and sealed, and a look of calm, organized purpose that Eleanor found genuinely steadying. "Are you ready?" Judith asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. Nathaniel stood up. He looked at Eleanor. "May I?" He gestured toward William, a question. She handed him his son. He held William against his chest and looked down at him for a moment. Then he looked up at Eleanor. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens today, whatever you decide about us after all of this, I will not contest your rights. To be here, to be his mother, to whatever you want." He held her gaze. "That is not contingent on anything." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about all the ways she could respond to that. She had several responses ready, some of them harder than others. She chose the honest one. "I know," she said. "I believe that." Something in his face eased slightly, the way a person eases when they have been carrying a weight and are allowed to set it down just for a moment. "Then let's go," he said. They went. The county market was already alive when they arrived at 7:30. Summer markets in Virginia started early. Before the heat built, and by the time the Ashford carriage pulled up, there were already a dozen stalls open, conversations running, children underfoot, the general busy noise of a community conducting its morning business. People noticed immediately. Eleanor felt it, the shift in the atmosphere, the way conversations stuttered and resumed at lower volume, the way heads turned and then turned away, with the particular studied casualness of people who are very much looking while pretending not to. She had expected this. She kept her back straight and her chin level, and she did not hurry. Nathaniel stepped down first, and then turned and held up his hand to help her down, and she took it, and she stepped onto the market ground beside him, with William in her arms, and that image, Whatever it looked like from the outside was apparently enough to create a visible ripple through the nearest cluster of people. She heard someone say her name. She could not tell the tone. Nathaniel kept his hand at her elbow. Not gripping, not possessive, just present. A steady point of contact that said without words that they had arrived here together. The magistrate's office was at the far end of the market square, a modest building appropriately official. Judith had confirmed the previous evening that Magistrate Harlan kept early hours during the summer months and would be in his office by 7. They walked toward it. They did not get there without being intercepted. The man who stepped in front of them was named George Pemberton, and he was one of the 3 largest landowners in the county, after Nathaniel himself, and he had known the Ashford family for 20 years. He was a blunt man with a red face and forthright opinions, and he looked at Nathaniel, and then at Eleanor, and then at William, and said without preamble, "Is that your son?" "He is," Nathaniel said. George Pemberton looked at Eleanor. "You are well, Mrs. Ashford." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Pemberton." He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he is taking inventory of a situation and finding it different from the version he was given. "Your uncle was at my house last night," he said to Nathaniel. "Late. He had a good deal to say." "I imagine he did," Nathaniel said. "I did not invite him," George Pemberton said. He looked at Nathaniel directly. "And I did not find his story convincing. I have known you since you were 12 years old, Nathaniel. I did not say so to Charles because it was late and I was tired and I wanted him out of my house, but I am saying so now." Eleanor felt something unexpected move through her chest at that. "Thank you, George," Nathaniel said quietly. Pemberton looked at William one more time. He touched the brim of his hat to Eleanor. Then he stepped aside and let them pass. They reached the magistrate's office. Harlan was a small man, spare and precise, with the economical manner of someone who has spent many years dealing with the full range of human difficulty and has arrived at a policy of engaged neutrality. He looked at Eleanor, then at Nathaniel, then at the child, then at Judith, who had produced her folder before anyone had said a word. "Mr. Ashford," he said. "Mrs. Ashford." "Magistrate Harlan," Nathaniel said. "I need to file a formal recognition." Harlan looked at the baby. "The child is yours." "He is." William Nathaniel Ashford, born July 3, 1817, delivered by Margaret Hale, witnessed by Joseph and Annie Colton. Nathaniel looked at Judith, who produced the birth documentation, and set it on the desk. "My wife has documentation. I am here to make the acknowledgement formal and on the public record." Harlan looked at the documents. He was a man who read carefully, and he read carefully now, turning pages with the unhurried attention of someone who understands that speed is not always an asset in his profession. He read the birth attestation. He read the midwife's documentation. He looked at the dates. "Your wife was absent from the household during the relevant period," he said. "She was," Nathaniel said. Through my actions, she was away from the estate. The circumstances of her absence were based on false information that I received and acted on incorrectly. I am in the process of addressing that situation legally." He paused. "But the child is mine, without question." Harlan looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Ashford, you confirm this?" "I do," she said. He looked at William. He reached into his desk and produced the formal recognition ledger. He wrote. He wrote for several minutes in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who understands that what he sets down on paper will outlast every person in this room. He wrote until it was done, and then he turned the ledger around on his desk, and he handed Nathaniel the pen. Nathaniel signed. He handed the pen to Eleanor. She signed below him. Harlan added his own signature and the date and the official seal of the county magistrate's office, and the thing was done. William Nathaniel Ashford was on the public record as the legitimate heir of Nathaniel Charles Ashford and his wife Eleanor Grace. Ashford, born July 3, 1817, prior to the 40th birthday of the father, precisely as Judith had required. Charles was too late. They were still in the magistrate's office when the door opened behind them. Eleanor turned. The man in the doorway was Percy Hollis. She recognized him from Judith's description, which had been accurate and not flattering. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the way of a man who spends money on appearance as a form of professional credibility, and he had a folder under his own arm and an expression that had clearly been prepared for a different version of what he was walking into. He looked at the ledger on the desk. He looked at the magistrate's seal. He looked at Judith Crane, who looked back at him with the particular expression of a woman who holds a better hand and knows it. "Mr. Hollis," Judith said pleasantly. "What a coincidence." Percy Hollis looked at his folder. He looked at the ledger. He did the arithmetic. "I appear to have arrived late," he said finally. "By approximately 15 minutes, Judith agreed. "Would you like a copy of the record for your client's reference? It will save him some trouble." Hollis looked at Nathaniel. Something moved through his expression, not quite shame, but the professional version of it. The discomfort of a man who has just been caught doing something technically legal but thoroughly disreputable in a room full of people who know exactly what he was there to do. "That will not be necessary," he said. He turned and left. The magistrate watched him go with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things and is mildly impressed that he is still capable of mild surprise. He looked at Nathaniel. "That was Charles Ashford's man," he said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He was filing a preemptive challenge. He was attempting to." Harlan looked at the signed ledger. "Well," he said simply, "he's welcome to try." They walked back out into the market. What had shifted in 20 minutes was considerable. Word had traveled, it always does, in places where people know each other's business and have been watching a particular situation with invested interest. Eleanor could feel it in the way people looked at her differently than they had when they arrived. Not all of them were warm. This was not a story with a universal reaction, and she did not expect one. But several people who had pointedly not acknowledged her when they came in were now catching her eye, and the acknowledgement meant something even when it was small. Margaret Paxton, the minister's wife, crossed the market specifically to reach Eleanor and took her hand and held it and said, "I am so very glad to see you well." She looked at William. And him. She looked at Nathaniel with an expression that was considerably more measured. Both of them. "Thank you, Mrs. Paxton," Eleanor said. A farmer named Aldous Webb, who had sold tobacco to Ashford Estate for 15 years, stopped Nathaniel and shook his hand with a firmness that said more than the few words he added to it. And then, at the far end of the market, Eleanor saw Charles. He had arrived. Perhaps he had been there already. Perhaps he had come when Percy Hollis sent word. Perhaps he had anticipated this outcome and come to witness it anyway, because a man like Charles Ashford does not simply retreat to a room and absorb a defeat. He has to see it. He has to be present for it, standing in it, calculating the next angle. He was standing near a stall at the far end of the square, and he was watching them. His face was composed. His hands were at his sides. Nathaniel saw him at almost exactly the same moment Eleanor did. She felt the shift in him, the tension that moved through the arm that was lightly at her elbow. "Nathaniel," she said quietly. "I see him." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Not here," she said. "Not today. Today is not for that." She held his gaze. "Today is for William. The rest comes after." A pause. She watched him make the choice, the conscious, deliberate choosing not to cross the market and confront his uncle in front of 50 people, which would turn this morning from a declaration into a spectacle and give Charles exactly the kind of chaotic scene he could use. "You're right," Nathaniel said. "I know," she said. They turned and walked the other direction. Charles watched them go. The afternoon was harder than the morning. The morning had had purpose and momentum and the particular clarity of a task that needs doing. The afternoon had all the complexity of what comes after the task. The returning to the house, the sitting in rooms together, the navigating of a space that had once been ordinary and was now charged with everything that had happened and everything that had not yet been resolved. Judith left at 3 o'clock. She had people to contact, actions to set in motion, a deposition she needed to arrange from the clerk at Weston and Carr. She pressed Eleanor's hand at the door and said very quietly, "You did well today. Both of you." She looked briefly at Nathaniel. "Particularly you, Mrs. Ashford." Eleanor almost smiled. After Judith left, Mrs. Graves took William for his afternoon sleep, and Eleanor and Nathaniel were alone in the house together for the first time. They ended up in the library. It was not planned. Eleanor was not sure how it happened. She had been in the parlor, and then she was in the library doorway, and Nathaniel was already inside, standing near the shelf by the window, and he was holding the lopsided wooden bird. He heard her in the doorway and turned. He looked at the bird in his hand. He looked at her. "You took it with you," he said. "I took it with me," she confirmed. "You had 2 bags." "It fit in my pocket." He turned the bird in his hand, set it back on the shelf, looked at it for a moment longer. "I made that in our first winter," he said. "I know. You worked on it for 2 weeks." He looked at her then. "You counted." "I noticed," she said. "There is a difference." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been since you left. I have been going over things. Everything I can remember from the past 2 years. Every conversation. Every time Charles said something and what he said and how I responded to it." "I know that feeling," Eleanor said. "I keep finding the moments," he said. "The exact moments where I could have, where if I had simply—" He stopped. His hand came up and pressed briefly against his forehead. "There was a night in November, last year. You came to me and you said you thought Beaumont had not been honest. You said you had a feeling that you couldn't prove it, but you had a feeling. And I—" He stopped again. Eleanor remembered that night. "You told me I was looking for someone to blame," she said. "Yes. Charles was in the house that week," she said. "He had been for 10 days. "Yes." He looked at her directly. "I know that now. I should have known it then. The pattern, looking back, the pattern is so clear that I cannot understand how I—" He exhaled. "But that is the problem, isn't it? You don't see the pattern while you're inside it. You only see it when you're outside it looking back, and by then, the damage is done." Eleanor moved into the room and sat in one of the armchairs. Not his, not reaching for the specific, ordinary intimacy of their old positions, just sitting in a room with him because the room was where they were. "Nathaniel," she said, "I need you to hear something." He waited. "What Charles did was done to both of us," she said. "He used you. He manipulated your grief, your sense of duty, your love for this estate and this family. He used every good quality you have and turned it against you. Against us." She held his gaze. "I know that. I have known it since I read Beaumont's journal entry. And I am not going to pretend that what you did not hurt me, because it did. Sending me away hurt me in ways I will probably be working through for longer than I can see right now." "Eleanor." "Let me finish," she said, not harshly. "It hurt me. And the specific hurt of it was not just the action, but the reason that you trusted a system over a person. That you trusted a doctor's report over 6 years of knowing me. That is what I need you to understand, not so you can feel worse about it, but so you know what the actual problem was." She paused. "The problem was not that you were deceived. The problem was that you were deceivable about me after 6 years." Silence. He sat down in the other chair. He sat forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and he looked at the floor between them. "You're right," he said. "I know I am." He looked up. "What do I do with that?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I don't have an answer to that question. I came back here for William and to stop Charles, and because the truth needed to be said in this house. I did not come back with a plan for the rest of it." "Do you want there to be a rest of it?" he asked. Eleanor sat with that question. She looked at the shelf by the window, where the lopsided bird sat in its same spot. She looked at the armchair she was sitting in, where she had sat on hundreds of winter evenings. She looked at Nathaniel, at the face she had mapped in 6 years of sleeping beside someone. The face that was tired now and older looking than it had been 4 weeks ago, and carrying the weight of a man who has spent a month understanding what he did wrong. "I don't know yet," she said again. "And I am going to need you to be all right with not knowing yet." He held her gaze. "I am," he said. "I'll wait." "Don't wait," she said. "Live. Do the things you need to do, deal with Charles, fix what he damaged in the estate, be William's father. Don't make me into a destination you are waiting to arrive at. That is its own kind of pressure, and I won't carry it." He looked at her for a long moment. "When did you become—" He stopped. "Become what?" "This," he said, not dismissively, with something that sounded close to awe. This clear about things, this certain. Eleanor thought about Margaret Hale in the farmhouse, about Judith at the kitchen table, about Annie Colton, humming in the rocking chair, about 4 weeks of being the only person responsible for herself and a newborn child and a legal strategy and her own future. "I have always been this," she said. "You simply did not always see it." He absorbed that. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't." Mrs. Graves knocked at the library door an hour before supper. She had William, who was awake and demanding with the uncomplicated insistence of an infant who has opinions about his schedule. Eleanor rose to take him, and Nathaniel rose too, and for a moment they were both standing in the middle of the library, with the evening light coming through the window and their son between them. Nathaniel reached out and adjusted the blanket around William with one careful hand. Eleanor watched him do it. She thought, "I do not know what comes next. I do not know if 6 years can survive what was done to them. I do not know if trust, once it has been this specifically broken, can be repaired into something that functions as well as the original." She thought, "I know that this man is not his uncle. I know that this man was deceived. I know that being deceived does not absolve the choices he made with what he was given. And I know that those are two separate things that will need to be held separately for a long time." She thought, "I am standing in the library that was given to me on my wedding night, and I am holding my son, and my husband is adjusting his blanket with hands that are learning to be careful, and nothing is resolved, and nothing is simple, and the road from here is longer than I can see." She thought, "I have survived worse uncertainty than this, and more recently than this." She looked at Nathaniel. He was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything. William made a small sound of impatience because he was 3 weeks old and had no interest in his parents' complicated emotional landscapes and wanted to be fed. Eleanor looked down at him. "All right," she said softly. "I hear you." She carried him out of the library. Nathaniel stayed where he was for a moment in the room that had always been hers. He looked at the lopsided bird on the shelf. He looked at the chair where she had been sitting. He looked at the door through which she had just walked, carrying their son out into the rest of the house. Then he followed. Not chasing, not pursuing, just moving in the same direction through the same house toward whatever came next. It was a small thing, but it was the first small thing that felt in any way like the beginning of something rather than the end. The letter from Charles arrived 3 days later. Not a messenger this time. A formal letter delivered by post addressed to Nathaniel in the careful hand of a man who had decided that if performances were required, he would perform correctly. Eleanor was in the kitchen with Mrs. Graves. When Nathaniel came in holding it, and she knew from the way he was holding it, 2 fingers slightly away from his body, the way you hold something you are not certain is safe, that it was not good. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at her. She dried her hands and picked it up and read it. It was 3 pages. The first page was an appeal to family loyalty, written in language so precisely calibrated to sound reasonable that it would have worked on her once before she knew what reasonable-sounding language from Charles Ashford actually meant. He spoke of misunderstandings. He spoke of the pressures of managing a large estate. He spoke of his genuine concern for Nathaniel's well-being and legacy, which was, she now understood, the most honest sentence in the letter, because Charles's concern for the Ashford legacy had always been genuine. It was just that the legacy he was concerned about was his own access to it. The second page was the threat dressed in the language of regret. He intended to pursue a legal challenge to the codicil's removal. He had retained Percy Hollis. He believed the courts would find in his favor if given the full picture of events. He wanted Nathaniel to understand that this path was available to him, and that he would use it if necessary, but that he would prefer not to, that he hoped instead for a private resolution between family members. Private resolution. Eleanor read that phrase twice. The third page was an offer. 20% of the estate's annual income paid to Charles as a settlement in exchange for his formal renunciation of all claims and his silence on the matter of Eleanor's absence and the circumstances of William's birth. She set the letter down. She looked at Nathaniel. "No," she said. "I know," he said. "I is frightened," she said. "This letter is from a frightened man. He would not be offering a settlement if he believed he had a solid case. He would simply file. Nathaniel looked at the letter on the table. He might file anyway, even if the case is weak. He might, she agreed. But a weak case filed publicly is also a public accounting of everything he did. Every payment, every conversation with Beaumont, every piece of what Judith has documented. She held Nathaniel's gaze. Charles does not want that in open court any more than we do. He would prefer the private resolution, because a private resolution buries the evidence. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. And if we refuse, and he files anyway, then we answer him in court with everything we have, Eleanor said. And we let the county watch Charles Ashford explain why he paid $500 to a physician to tell his nephew his wife was barren. A pause. Mrs. Greaves, who had been making herself very busy at the far end of the kitchen and not listening at all, made a small sound that was not quite a word, but contained a full sentence's worth of opinion. Nathaniel almost smiled. It was the first time Eleanor had seen anything close to a smile on his face since she came back, and it lasted only a moment, but it was real. "Write to Judith," he said. "Tell her about the letter." "I already am," Eleanor said, pulling paper toward her from the kitchen shelf. Judith's response arrived the following morning, which meant she had written it the same day Eleanor's letter reached her, which meant she had been expecting something like this. Her instructions were characteristically precise. Do not respond to Charles directly. Do not negotiate. File a formal complaint with the county magistrate's office regarding the falsification of medical documentation. Harlan was already aware of the situation and had expressed willingness to receive such a complaint. Begin the process of deposing the clerk from Weston and Carr, whose testimony regarding the bank transfers was now on paper and could be submitted as evidence. Contact the Richmond Medical Board regarding James Beaumont's conduct. And one more thing, which Judith had written at the bottom in her neat, deliberate hand. Margaret Hale has found 2 additional women in the county whose medical evaluations by Beaumont in the past 3 years produced questionable diagnoses. Both women are willing to speak. This is no longer only about Eleanor Ashford. Eleanor read that last paragraph 3 times. She sat with it. She thought about those 2 women, whoever they were, their names not yet known to her, their stories not yet told to her. She thought about what it meant that Charles had apparently used Beaumont not just once, but multiple times, for multiple purposes, on multiple women who had stood in the way of something he wanted or needed or was simply willing to sacrifice for convenience. She thought about the particular loneliness of being told your body was broken and having no one who believed you when you said otherwise. She folded the letter carefully. She went to find Nathaniel. Howe was in the study, which was where he spent most of his mornings, now going through the estate records, with the focused, slightly grim attention of a man who has realized that 2 years of his uncle's involvement in estate management requires 2 years of careful review. He looked up when Eleanor came in. She handed him Judith's letter. He read it. He read the last paragraph twice. He set it down. 2 other women, he said. At least 2, Eleanor said. Those are the ones Margaret has found so far. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Beaumont needs to be stopped. Yes. Not just for us. For... He stopped. He looked at the letter again. This is larger than our situation. Yes, Eleanor said again. It is. He looked at her. What do you want to do? The question landed differently than it might have once. He had asked her things before in the early years. Her opinion on the harvest schedule. Her preference about social engagements. Whether she thought a particular business arrangement was sound. But the specific question of what do you want to do in matters that went beyond household management was not a question he had asked her in a long time. She understood now that this was not entirely his own doing. That Charles had been deliberate in gradually narrowing the space where her judgment was consulted, and that Nathaniel had let it happen without seeing it happen, which was its own category of failure. But the question was being asked now. I want to go to Richmond, she said. He blinked. Richmond. I want to go to the medical board myself, with Judith, not with a letter in person. She held his gaze. I want to sit in a room with the people who have the authority to revoke James Beaumont's license. and I want to put everything we have in front of them, and I want to look them in the eye while they read it. And I want to bring Margaret, and if those two other women are willing, I want to bring them too." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. That will draw attention," he said. "Good," she said. Another pause. Then, "When?" "End of the week," she said. "Before Charles has the chance to get to Beaumont first and prepare him." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I'll come with you." She had not asked him to. She looked at him steadily. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to. Beaumont looked me in the eye and lied to me about my wife. I would like to be in the room when that is formally acknowledged." He held her gaze. "If that is all right with you." Eleanor considered this. "It is all right with me," she said. They left for Richmond on Friday morning. Eleanor and Nathaniel and Judith and Margaret with William in his basket, and Hector driving, and Mrs. Graves standing at the top of the front steps watching them go with an expression of fierce, contained satisfaction. The road to Richmond took most of the day. They did not talk the whole way. They talked in the way of people conducting a shared undertaking practically purposefully about what would be said and in what order and who would speak when. Judith had been to the medical board before on other matters, and she knew the procedures. Margaret had her midwifery records, decades of them, and had selected the specific documentation that bore on Beaumont's conduct. Eleanor had her own account written out in full at Judith's instruction, signed and dated, and Nathaniel had the bank records, which he had looked at perhaps 30 times in the past week, and which he handled now with the particular careful fury of a man who has fully understood what they mean and has not yet found an adequate outlet for that understanding. At one point, when the road was smooth and William was asleep and Margaret was dozing in her corner of the carriage, Judith leaned across and said quietly to Eleanor, "How are you?" Eleanor looked at her. "I am fine. That is not what I asked." Eleanor glanced at Nathaniel, who was looking out the window with his profile turned away. She looked back at Judith. "I don't know," she said honestly, which was perhaps the most accurate answer available. Judith nodded, as if that was the answer she had expected and found acceptable. "That is the right answer," she said. Anyone who knew how they were after all of this in this short a time would be lying. Richmond was louder and hotter than the county, full of the compressed energy of a city conducting its summer business with the particular urgency of commerce that does not take seasons off. The medical board offices were in a building on the east side of the city, respectable and institutional, and the clerk at the front desk looked at the four of them and at William, who was awake and looking around with his usual expression of focused curiosity, with a professional neutrality that broke slightly when Judith set her folder on his desk and said she needed to see the full board today on a matter of urgent professional misconduct. They waited for an hour, then they were shown in. There were 5 men on the board. Eleanor looked at them as she entered their ages, their bearing the way they settled into their chairs, with the mild impatience of men who have been called from other work and expect this to be resolved quickly. She had rehearsed nothing. She had prepared her document, but she had not rehearsed her voice, because she knew from experience that rehearsed voices in difficult rooms always sounded like rehearsed voices. The chairman, a heavy-set man named Dr. Elias Crawford, looked at the assembled group, and then at the infant, and then back at the group. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, looking at Eleanor, "you have brought a complaint against James Beaumont." "I have," Eleanor said. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that he was paid $500 by my husband's uncle to falsify a medical examination of me and deliver a verdict that had been agreed upon in advance," she said. "On the grounds that this verdict, that I was permanently incapable of bearing children, was not only false, but was known to be false at the time of its delivery, as Dr. Beaumont's own private journal confirms." She set the journal pages on the table in front of the chairman. She watched him read the first line. She watched his expression change. "This is Beaumont's hand," he said. "My legal counsel can confirm the attribution," Eleanor said. "Additionally, we have banking records showing the financial transfers from Charles Ashford to Beaumont, and the testimony of an employee of the banking firm who processed those transfers." She nodded to Judith, who placed her documents beside the journal pages. "And?" She looked at Margaret. Margaret Hale stepped forward. She was 61 years old and walked with a limp, and she stood in that room with the absolute authority of a woman who has spent 37 years keeping people alive and has never once been intimidated by a room full of men with titles. "I am Margaret Hale," she said. "I am the midwife who delivered Mrs. Ashford's son 4 weeks ago, a son whose existence, this board should note, contradicts Dr. Beaumont's diagnosis in the most definitive possible manner." She placed her own documents on the table. "I have also identified 2 other women in our county, whose medical evaluations by Dr. Beaumont in recent years produced diagnoses I believe to be similarly compromised. Both women have given written statements. I have them here." Crawford looked at the statements. He looked at the man to his left and then at the man to his right. "Where is Beaumont currently practicing?" he asked his clerk. "Richmond, sir, on Merchant Street." "Send for him," Crawford said. The room held itself in a particular suspended state for the 40 minutes it took Beaumont to arrive. Nobody left. Nobody suggested they should reconvene at a later date. Crawford read through the documents with the focused attention of a man who is understanding page by page that something serious has occurred on his watch, and the specific discomfort of that understanding was visible in the set of his shoulders. When Beaumont arrived, he came in with the confidence of a man who has been called to a professional meeting and expects to manage it. He came in and stopped. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at William in her arms. He looked at the documents on the table. The confidence went out of his face the way air goes out of something punctured, not all at once, but irreversibly. "Dr. Beaumont," Crawford said, "sit down." What followed was not a trial. It was not a formal hearing with procedural protections and legal arguments. It was a conversation that lasted 2 hours, and it was one of the most controlled and methodical dismantlings Eleanor had ever witnessed, because Crawford was a man who had been in this position before, who had sat across from a colleague and had to establish fact by fact what that colleague had done, and he was both thorough and relentless. Beaumont denied the first accusation. He denied it with the particular bluster of a man who has a prepared denial, which suggested he had anticipated this moment at some level and had a story ready. Crawford put the bank records in front of him. The bluster became explanation. The payment had been for a consultation, unrelated to the examination, a different matter entirely. Crawford put the journal pages in front of him. The explanation stopped. There was a long silence. "That is private," Beaumont said finally. "Those pages were obtained without my—" "Dr. Beaumont," Crawford said, "your own words describe the arrangement in sufficient detail that the question of how those words were obtained is considerably less relevant than what they say." He looked at Beaumont over the top of the pages. "You knew this woman was not barren." A pause. "The situation was—" "You knew," Crawford said. "You wrote it yourself. You used the word temporary. You used the word reversible." He set the pages down. "You took $500 to tell her husband otherwise." Beaumont said nothing. Eleanor sat very still. She was watching a man who had cost her 2 years of her life and the near destruction of everything she had. Watching him sit across a table from the consequences of what he had done and finding that it did not feel the way she might have expected it to feel. It did not feel like satisfaction. It felt more like the specific exhaustion that comes after a very long effort, and the particular clarity that arrives when something that has been uncertain for a long time is finally irrevocably settled. She looked at Nathaniel. Howe was looking at Beaumont. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on his knees. She thought about what it must feel like to sit across from the man who had looked him in the eye 2 years ago and delivered a lie that had cost him his marriage, his trust in himself, and 4 weeks of knowing he had a son. She thought about the specific restraint it was taking him not to say something, because she knew him well enough to know that the stillness was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. He felt her looking and turned. Their eyes met. She gave him a small, steady nod. He turned back to the table. Crawford suspended Beaumont's license before they left the building. It was not the end of the legal matter. There would be proceedings. There would be formal hearings. There was the question of the other women's cases, and the question of what constituted criminal conduct versus professional misconduct, and all the complicated machinery of consequence. But the license was suspended, and that was real. And that meant James Beaumont would not be examining another woman under an arrangement with another Charles Ashford, at least not for a considerable time. They walked out of this building into the Richmond afternoon, and Eleanor stood for a moment on the steps and breathed. Margaret came to stand beside her. "Well," Margaret said. "Well," Eleanor agreed. "Your boy slept through the entire thing," Margaret observed. Eleanor looked down at William, who was indeed asleep in his sling, with the boneless serenity of someone entirely unconcerned with medical board proceedings. "He is a sensible child," Eleanor said. Margaret made a sound that was most of a laugh. Judith was behind them, already talking to Nathaniel in her practical way about the next steps. The filing with the magistrate's office back home, the formal response to Charles's letter, the deposition of the banking clerk. Nathaniel was listening with the focused attention he had been giving everything this week, asking precise questions, taking in the answers without deflection. Eleanor watched him. She thought he is learning. Not just the legal situation, something larger than that. He is learning the habit of looking at things completely instead of looking at the version that is easiest to carry. It was not a small thing to learn. Most people never managed it. Charles filed his challenge 3 weeks later. Eleanor was not surprised. She had told Nathaniel he would, and Nathaniel had believed her, and they had been prepared. Judith handled the response with the efficient precision of a woman who has been waiting for a specific move and has had the counter-move ready for a month. The challenge cited the codicil, cited the circumstances of William's birth outside the household, cited the gap in Eleanor's presence as grounds for questioning the child's legitimacy. The response cited the bank records, the journal pages, the depositions, the magistrate's formal record, the medical board's suspension of Beaumont, the testimony of Margaret Hale, Joseph and Annie Colton, Judith Crane, and 4 other witnesses to various aspects of what Charles had done. It also cited a statement from 3 of the late Ashford Sr.'s personal staff men and women who had been in the house when the codicil was allegedly added, who stated clearly and consistently that the elder Mr. Ashford had been in significantly diminished mental capacity in the final weeks of his life, and had been visited repeatedly by Charles during that period without Nathaniel's knowledge. That last piece had come from Mrs. Graves. Eleanor had not known Mrs. Graves had this information. She had not known because she had not thought to ask, because she had not known to think to ask, and Mrs. Graves had come to her one evening in the kitchen, sat down across from her with her hands folded and said, "There are things about the time before Mr. Ashford Sr. passed that I have not spoken of because no one asked me. I am asking myself now. May I tell you?" Eleanor had said yes. Mrs. Graves had talked for an hour. Eleanor had written down every word. The challenge was dismissed in October, 2 weeks before Nathaniel's 40th birthday. Percy Hollis sent a brief note informing Nathaniel that he was withdrawing from the matter. The note did not say why, but Eleanor understood a man like Hollis did not attach himself to sinking ships once the water was clearly rising. Charles did not come to the house. He did not write. He disappeared into whatever calculation he was running about his next available move, and Eleanor let him run it because she had more important things to do than monitor his retreat. The morning the dismissal arrived, Nathaniel came to find her in the library. She was feeding William, who was 6 weeks old now, and had developed very firm opinions about his schedule and the quality of attention paid to him. She looked up when Nathaniel came in. He held out the document. She read it. She handed it back. "It's done," he said. "This part is done," she said. "The rest is ongoing." He knew what she meant. The medical board proceedings, the question of criminal charges against Charles, which Judith was still exploring, the review of all estate contracts that Charles had touched. These were not things that ended in a day. "Yes," he said. He sat down in the other armchair, his chair, the one he had always used, the one that was simply his in the same way the library was simply hers. He looked at his son. "He's gotten bigger." 6 weeks is a significant developmental period, Eleanor said. "He looks less." Nathaniel paused. "Less alarming," Eleanor offered. "I was going to say uncertain," Nathaniel said. "He looked uncertain before, like he was still deciding." Eleanor looked at William. "He was," she said. "They all are at the beginning. They're working out who they are." I understand the feeling, Nathaniel said quietly. She looked at him. I was looking at William, not at her, which was perhaps why he said it. The thing he had been carrying for 6 weeks since she had come back since the market and the magistrate's office, and the long, careful, wordless work of two people in the same house navigating an enormous amount of unsaid and unsettled things. I have been trying to understand, he said, what kind of man I am. I thought I knew. I thought I was my father's son. I ran this land. I was decent to my people. I loved my wife. I thought those things were enough to constitute a person. He paused. Then I spent 6 weeks being told what I had let happen, what I had let someone do to you, what I had done myself with my own choices. He looked at her then. And I realized that knowing what kind of man you want to be is not the same as being that man. And I had been very confused about the difference for a very long time. The library was quiet. What are you going to do about that? Eleanor asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. I don't entirely know yet, he said. But I have started with the people on this estate. The contracts, the wages, Hector has been underpaid for 3 years. I did not know because I did not look closely enough. He said this plainly without excuse. I am looking closely now. Eleanor nodded. Margaret mentioned, he continued, that there are women in the county who have been through similar situations to yours. Women who received questionable medical evaluations. Women who were dismissed by their families or communities on the basis of things that were told to them, rather than things that were true. He held her gaze. She said you had spoken about wanting to do something, when you were in the farmhouse. Eleanor looked at him. She had not known Margaret had said that to him. She had not asked Margaret to. I don't know what I said exactly, Eleanor said carefully. She said you asked questions about what resources those women had, what support existed, whether there was anyone who helped them. He paused. There isn't, she said, not anything organized. Eleanor sat with this. I have the old Miller building, Nathaniel said. On the county road. It has been empty for 2 years. I have been trying to decide what to do with it. He looked at her. I am not proposing anything. I am not making decisions about your life or what you want to do with it. I am telling you a fact about a building and asking if it is relevant to anything you might be thinking about. It was the most careful sentence she had ever heard from him. She almost smiled. It might be, she said. He nodded. He did not press further. He looked back at William. They sat in the library together for another 20 minutes without talking much, and it was the first time since Eleanor had come back that the silence between them felt less like the absence of resolution and more like the presence of something that was cautiously, carefully, genuinely beginning. The Sunday service in November was the first time Eleanor and Nathaniel appeared together in a genuinely public setting since the market in July. It was different in November. They were no longer conducting an emergency declaration, no longer racing Charles's maneuvers to a finish line. They were simply two people walking into a church together with their son in the ordinary way of families. People noticed. People had been noticing for 4 months, and by now the county had a reasonably accurate picture of what had happened. Not every detail, not the private conversations in the library or the farmhouse kitchen, but the broad shape of it, the scheme, the doctor, the uncle, the dismissed wife who came back with documents and a son and changed everything. The reactions were varied as they always are in small communities where everyone has known everyone for 20 years and has their own relationship to the people involved. Some people were warm. Some people were reserved. Some people were watching with the quiet, interested attention of witnesses to something they will describe to their grandchildren. The minister's wife, Mrs. Paxton, stopped Eleanor at the door. I heard about the Miller building, she said. Margaret mentioned it. Eleanor looked at her. Margaret mentions a great deal. She does. Mrs. Paxton agreed entirely without apology. I want to help. Whatever you are planning. I have been thinking about those women for months since everything came out. I have been thinking about what it means that they had no one. She held Eleanor's gaze. I want to help. Tell me what you need. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then, come to the house Thursday afternoon. Bring anyone else you think would be useful. Mrs. Paxton nodded. I will bring 4 people. She did in fact bring 6. They sat in the Ashford parlor. 6 women of varying ages and varying positions in the community, and Eleanor sat at the head of the table that had once been used for social calls and laid out what she was thinking. Not a grand plan, not a sweeping institution, but something practical and real, a place and people, and the specific work of ensuring that women in the county who were told things about themselves by men with authority had somewhere to go to ask a second question. Margaret was there. Judith had come from Charlottesville specifically for this meeting, which Eleanor had not asked her to do, and which was entirely characteristic. Annie Colton was there too, sitting at the far end of the table, and not saying much, but nodding at the right moments, with the particular weight of a woman who had been the first to open her door to a stranger in a carriage and knew exactly why it mattered. Nathaniel did not attend the meeting. He had taken William for the afternoon, a new development, the two of them on the estate together, while Eleanor worked, which had started cautiously and become gradually less cautious as Nathaniel learned what he was doing, and William decided with the pragmatic affection of infants everywhere that his father's shoulder was an acceptable place to fall asleep. When Eleanor came to find them at the end of the afternoon, they were in the kitchen. Nathaniel was sitting at the table with William propped against his chest, and he was telling the child about the tobacco crop, with the focused seriousness of a man who takes his audience seriously, regardless of their current comprehension level. William was listening with his head tilted and his expression of interested attention that Eleanor was beginning to think was just his face. She stopped in the doorway. Nathaniel looked up. "How did it go?" "Well," she said. "Mrs. Paxton brought 6 people. We have a plan." "A good one." "A practical one," she said. "Which is better?" He nodded. He looked back at William. "I told him about the East Field," he said. "He seemed interested." "He has your capacity for focus when something holds his attention," Eleanor said. Nathaniel looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, something quiet and genuine, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself. "Eleanor," he said. "Nathaniel." "I am not going to ask you where we are," he said. "I told you I wouldn't push and I won't. But I need to tell you something, and I need to tell it to you plainly, because I have spent too much of the past 2 years not saying things plainly." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I loved you when I sent you away, which does not excuse it, and which I understand does not change it, but it is true. And I love you now, which is a different thing. Now I love you having watched what you are made of when things are impossible, and that is a larger love than the one I had before." He held her gaze. "I am not asking you to do anything with that. I am just telling you because you deserve to have it said plainly, and I should have said it plainly a long time ago." The kitchen was very quiet. William made a small sound. Eleanor crossed the room and sat down at the table across from him and looked at her son and her husband. And she thought about the morning she had walked out of this house with 2 bags and a wooden bird in her pocket and had not looked back. She thought about Margaret Hale's voice in the farmhouse. "You are not dying, my dear. You are about to become a mother." She thought about what it meant that she had come back, not because she was sent for, not because she was persuaded, but because she decided. Because she had built the case and gathered the people and driven the road and walked through the door under her own power, and every step of that had been hers. She looked at Nathaniel. "I know you love me," she said. "I have known it for a long time, even when it was insufficient. Even when it was not enough to make you trust me." She paused. "The love was never the question." "I know," he said. "The question," she said, "was whether you would become the man who deserved it." He held her gaze. "And," he said, very quietly. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She looked at William asleep now, against his father's chest. She looked at the kitchen where Mrs. Graves would be back in an hour to start supper, and the library that had always been hers, and the drive outside where 4 months ago she had stepped into a carriage with 2 bags and decided not to look back. She thought about what looking forward required. "You are becoming him," she said. "You are not there yet, but you are becoming him." His eyes didn't leave hers. "Is that enough?" "For now," she said. Yes. It was not a fairy tale ending. She knew that, and she did not want one fairy tales ended in a moment, frozen and permanent, and she had no interest in being frozen. She wanted the thing that came after the moment, the mornings, the work, the slow and sometimes difficult construction of trust between two people who had been through something that could not be unfelt or unsaid, but could perhaps be transformed into something they had survived together instead of something that had destroyed them. She reached across the table and took his hand. Not a grand gesture, just a hand taken. He looked down at it. He turned his hand and held hers. They sat like that for a while, the three of them in the kitchen of Ashford Estate, the summer long over now, the autumn settling into the Virginia hills outside the window, a woman who had been sent away and come back, and a man who was learning to deserve her return, and a boy who had been born into the middle of all of it, and would grow up in a house where the most important things had been fought for, and chosen again. When Mrs. Graves came back to start supper, she found them still sitting there, and she looked at their joined hands on the table, and at the sleeping baby. And she went to the fireplace and began building up the fire without saying a single word, because some moments are better honored by warmth than by speech. The Miller Building opened in February of 1818. Eleanor did not give it a grand name. She did not make speeches. She opened the door, and Margaret was there, and Mrs. Paxton was there, and Annie Colton had driven 4 hours to be there, and the first woman who came in was someone Eleanor had never met, who had heard from someone who had heard from someone else, and who sat down at the table in the main room and said she had been told something about herself that she did not believe was true and did not know who to ask. Eleanor sat across from her. "Then you have come to the right place," she said. Outside, Nathaniel was waiting in the carriage with William, who was 6 months old and loud about his opinions, and had his father's hair and his mother's eyes, and belonged entirely and permanently to both of them. Nathaniel looked down at his son. "Your mother," he said to William, "is the most remarkable person I have ever known." William considered this with the seriousness appropriate to the statement. Then he grabbed Nathaniel's finger with both hands and held on, which was perhaps all the agreement the moment required. Inside the building, Eleanor listened, and the work began. They would say in later years that the Ashford name was remembered in that county not because of the land or the wealth or the legal battles of 1817, but because of the woman who had been sent away in a carriage one summer morning and had come back in the same summer with the truth in her hands and had never not once allowed that truth to be buried. They would say, Nathaniel Ashford became a good man, not a perfect one, but the kind of good that is earned and deliberate, the kind that costs something and is chosen anyway. They would say that William Nathaniel Ashford grew up knowing exactly who his mother was and what she had done, because she told him plainly and without embellishment when he was old enough to understand. And they would say that the library at Ashford Estate always had a lopsided wooden bird on the shelf by the window. Uneven wings, asymmetrical body. Obviously the work of a man who was not a skilled carver, but had spent 2 weeks on it anyway, and that Eleanor never moved it not once in all the years that followed. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was true.